As the quiet settles into the room, and the weight of the day begins to dissolve, let the sound of a voice in the dark guide you toward rest. There is nothing to solve here, nothing to remember, only the gradual softening of thought into stillness. If you wish, you may allow your breathing to find a slower rhythm, letting each exhale carry you deeper towards sleep. The night is long, and the hours stretch out, vast and unmeasured. In the deep past, the darkness was not empty. It was a canvas for the mind's persistent labor, for the silent, grinding work of solving problems of survival. Before the clash of armies, before the forging of tools meant for breaking other tools, there was simply the problem of the body in a cold world. The need for warmth, for shelter, for something to turn the raw materials of the earth into a barrier between soft flesh and a hard reality. This was the first design challenge, solved not with brilliance but with iteration. A rock that fits the hand. A way to sharpen that rock. A way to tie that rock to a stick. Each solution created a new comfort, and each comfort created a new vulnerability. The mind, once it began walking this path, found it difficult to stop. A sharp edge protects. A thicker hide defends against the edge. A heavier rock defeats the hide. It is a circular logic, a conversation between threat and response that never finds a final period, only a continual, slow escalation. The night outside the earliest shelters was filled with sounds that prompted this thinking. The rustle in the brush that was not the wind. The distant howl that spoke of organized hunger. The silence that was somehow more alarming than the noise. In response, the hands worked by firelight, not with urgency, but with a grim patience. They wrapped leather tighter. They tested the binding on a spear. They chipped one more flake from a stone edge, seeking a line that was perfectly, lethally straight. This was not innovation for its own sake. It was the slow addition of small, certain answers to a recurring question. How do I continue to be here when so many forces suggest I should not? The fire pops. An ember settles. The work continues, a silent dialogue between human need and a world that is indifferent to it. The problem of the sharp edge led, inevitably, to the problem of the surface meant to stop it. Animal hides gave way to cured leather. Leather gave way to layers of quilted fabric, stuffed with wool or tow. And then, metal entered the conversation. At first, it was a luxury, a glittering accent for the powerful. But the logic of escalation is democratic in its own way. What protects one man becomes a goal for another, and then a necessity for all who face him. The craft of the armorer became one of the central arts of an age. It was not about decoration, though decoration often followed. It was about solving a physics problem under life and death constraints. How to cover the body in a second skin that would turn aside a point or a blade, without locking the wearer in a motionless prison of his own protection. The solution was found in articulation, in the cunning geometry of overlapping plates. A shoulder became a puzzle of steel, each piece sliding over the next like the scales of a fish, allowing the arm to rise, to swing, to hold a weight. The hours spent at the forge were hours of profound focus. The hammer strikes were not random. They were a language, a way of convincing hard metal to take a new shape. Heat, strike, quench, test, adjust, heat again. The goal was a shell that was seamless in its function, a wearable architecture that made a man into something else, a figure of slow, formidable intent. Inside this shell, the world changed. Sound became a muffled rumble. Vision was framed by the narrow grid of a visor, breaking the world into a series of small, bright windows. Breath echoed hotly inside the helmet, a private rhythm in a metal chamber. The weight was constant, a bearing down that made every movement a conscious negotiation. To walk in full plate was to be perpetually aware of your own boundaries, of the exact space your body claimed. It was a mobile fortress, but a lonely one. The comfort it offered was the cold comfort of statistics, of increased odds. It said, "What is outside will have a harder time reaching what is inside." It did not say you were safe. It only said the moment of consequence might be delayed. And so, the tools evolved in response to the shell. If a surface cannot be cut, it can be dented. If it cannot be dented easily, the force can be concentrated onto a smaller point. The mindset shifted from penetration to transmission. A sword is an elegant thing, a line that seeks to divide. A mace is a simpler statement. It is a weight on a lever, and its purpose is to deliver shock. It does not argue with the armor, communicates through it. The craftsmen who made these weapons were engineers of consequence. They thought in terms of mass, velocity, and the transfer of energy. The flanged head of a mace was not an aesthetic choice. It was a way to focus the blow, to transform a wide impact into a series of narrow, devastating concussions. The armor might hold unbroken, but the body beneath, the bones, the organs, the delicate wiring of the brain, would receive the message in a language of vibration and trauma. The workshop where such tools were made was a loud, hot, repetitive place. The ringing of hammers was a constant backdrop. The air smelled of coal, hot metal, and the tang of quenching oil. A man would spend his days producing variations on a theme of impact. One after another, the heavy heads took shape, each a little different, each in answer to a rumor about the latest armor seen on a distant field. There was no grand design, only adaptation. A farmer's tool, a hammer for driving stakes, would be examined, its balance assessed, its weight considered. Then it would be repurposed, reinforced, given a longer haft or a thicker head. The line between tool and weapon was thin, often non-existent. Anything that could amplify force, that could turn a human muscle into a greater threat, was a candidate. This was innovation stripped of vanity. It was pragmatic, grim, and relentless. A weapon was not judged by its beauty, but by a simple binary metric. Did it work? Did it change the situation? The answer was always written in the results, not in treatises. The battlefield was the testing ground, the final laboratory where all theories met the chaos of reality. It was not a clean place of lines and maneuvers as later histories would sometimes paint it. It was a field of mud, churned by thousands of feet. It was a cacophony of shouted commands, screams, the crash of metal on metal, the deep shuddering impact of metal on wood, the terrible sound of metal on flesh. The air itself grew thick, with the dust of the ground, the mist of breath in the cold, the smoke of distant fires. In this chaos, the best-laid designs could fail. A sword could snap, a spear shaft could splinter, a man could slip in the mud, his careful armor suddenly becoming a trap, pinning him down, making him a turtle waiting for a hammer. In these moments, the evolutionary cycle accelerated wildly. What was at hand became what was used. A broken spear became a club. A fallen stone became a missile. The rim of a shield could be used to strike, not just to block. This was improvisation born of pure necessity, the mind working at its most primal level, discarding ceremony for function. The concept of a weapon expanded to include anything that could alter the immediate balance of danger. A handful of dirt thrown into the visor of an opponent. A cloak tossed over a man's head to blind and entangle him. The goal was singular: create an advantage, however small, however temporary. This was warfare at its most honest, stripped of pretense. It was not about glory. It was about the management of force and fear in a space of extreme disorder. The slow, deliberate work of the forge met the frantic, desperate ingenuity of the moment. Sometimes the former won, sometimes the latter. Often they merged into something terrible and effective. A knight, trained for years in the formal art of combat, could find himself undone by a peasant with a tool he'd used days before to thresh grain, now swung with the frantic strength of a cornered animal. The rules of the workshop did not apply here. The only rule was continuation. As the day of conflict wore on, the focus of the effort could shift from winning to enduring. The body, under its carapace of metal and padding, began to fail in quiet ways. Thirst was a constant torment, unreachable beneath the helm. The weight that was manageable for an hour became a crushing fatigue by the third or fourth. Muscles trembled with strain. Heat built up inside the armor, a stifling, sweat-drenched microclimate. The mind, too, began to fray. The intense concentration required to move, to watch for threats, to react, could not be sustained indefinitely. It would flicker. A moment of dullness would creep in. A man would find himself staring at a patch of mud, mesmerized by a pattern of trampled grass, while the world of violence continued around him. This was the true enemy, often more decisive than any sword point. The sheer, grinding exhaustion of sustained terror. The slowest part of the battle was not the beginning, but the long, painful middle, after the first rush was over and before any resolution was in sight. This was when formations truly broke down, not from tactical failure, but from human depletion. Men would drift, seeking pockets of stillness. The sounds would become more isolated. A single clash here, a groan there, the distant call of a horn. The field became a landscape of paused intentions, of stalled motion. The weapons, so carefully crafted, would hang heavy in numb hands. Their purpose remained, but the energy to enact it was draining away, replaced by a deep, bodily longing for stillness, for water, for the removal of the crushing weight from the shoulders. The setting sun would cast long, distorted shadows of men who looked less like warriors and more like exhausted laborers at the end of an impossible shift. The night, when it came, was often a mercy. It brought a cold, truceless quiet. The work of survival turned inward, to the tending of wounds, the sharing of water, the attempt to find a few hours of shivering sleep on the hard ground. The weapons were cleaned if there was energy. They were placed within reach, a cold comfort against the return of the sun. The cycle was not over. It was merely paused. The problem of the other person, and the problem of your own continued existence, would resume with the dawn. The thinking, the slow, iterative design work of threat and response, continued even in sleep, in the form of dreams of falling, of being chased, of metal that would not yield. The quiet of the night after a battle was a different quality of silence. It was not the absence of sound, but the presence of a thick, heavy stillness, woven through with the low moans of the wounded and the soft, steady sound of men trying to rest their broken bodies. Watchfires dotted the field, creating small islands of flickering light in a vast sea of darkness. Around these fires, the slow, mundane work of maintenance began. Blades were wiped clean with rags, the cloth catching on notches and burrs left by the day's impacts. The edges would be inspected by touch in the poor light, a thumb run lightly along the steel to find the imperfections that would need the whetstone come morning. Armor was unbuckled, piece by piece, each plate laid out on the ground like the shed carapace of some great insect. The padded garments beneath were soaked through with sweat and sometimes other fluids, their smell a peculiar mix of human salt, blood, and the sour odor of fear. Men moved slowly, their actions deliberate and pained, each motion a catalogue of new bruises and strained muscles. There was little talk. The energy for narration, for boasting or lamenting, had been spent. Communication was reduced to gestures, to the passing of a water skin, to a shared look that held entire conversations about luck and regret. This was the aftermath, a time not of victory or defeat, but of accounting. The body tallied its losses. A cracked rib made breathing a sharp, cautious exercise. A sprained wrist made the simple act of gripping a cup an ordeal. The mind, meanwhile, began its own inventory, replaying moments, searching for the pivot points, the instances where a different choice might have led to a different outcome. This mental work was as exhausting as the physical labor, but it was compulsive. The silence allowed it no distraction. The night sky, vast and indifferent, looked down upon the scene, its stars offering no commentary, no judgment, only their ancient, cold light. Within the walls of a town or castle, the night's rhythms were different, but no less shaped by the logic of threat and defense. The watchman walked his prescribed route along the battlements, his footsteps a slow, metronomic sound against the stone. His duty was not to fight, but to observe, to be a sensory organ for the sleeping community. His world was one of subtle signs, the absence of a familiar sound, a shape that moved when the wind did not, the scent of a fire where none should be. He was a node in a network of vigilance, a system designed to compress the time between a threat's emergence and the community's response. Below him, in the workshops that lined the narrow streets, the day's creative destruction had its counterpart in creative repair. The blacksmith's forge might still glow, not for making weapons, but for mending them. A sword with a bent tip was heated, carefully hammered straight, and tempered again. A mail shirt with a torn link was laid across a knee, and with pliers and patience, the broken ring was removed and a new one woven into the intricate metallic fabric. This work was meticulous, slow, and deeply unheroic. It was the work of preservation, of extending the functional life of objects whose sole purpose was to be risked and damaged. The armorer, by the light of an oil lamp, might work on a dented breastplate, using a rounded hammer and a sandbag to slowly, gently persuade the steel back into something resembling its original shape. Each tap was a tiny correction, a reversal of the day's violence. The object was not made new. The dent would always leave a faint memory in the metal, but it was made serviceable again. This cycle of damage and repair was a fundamental economic and spiritual rhythm of the age. Value was not in disposable goods, but in things that could be maintained, that could bear the marks of their use and still function. A weapon was not just a tool. It was a repository of labor, of scarce materials, and of the hope that it would see its owner through another season of danger. In the countryside, far from the concentrated violence of the battlefield or the fortified town, the relationship with threat was more diffuse but no less constant. The peasant's home was a fortress in miniature, its defenses measured not in stone walls but in vigilance and simple barriers. A stout door, a shuttered window, a watchful dog, these were the first line of a personal defense strategy. The weapons here were not specialized. They were the tools of daily survival repurposed. An axe for splitting wood could split other things. A sickle for harvesting grain could harvest a different kind of yield. The creativity was born of scarcity, of not having the luxury of a dedicated armory. The threat might be a wolf, a bandit, or a foraging soldier from one side or another. The response was similarly universal. A loud noise to scare, a bright light to disorient, a physical barrier to delay, and if necessary, a direct and brutal application of force with whatever was at hand. The night here was filled with different tensions. The crack of a branch outside could be an animal or it could be a man. The mind would lie in the dark, parsing the sounds, assigning probabilities. Sleep was shallow, easily broken. The body learned to rest in a state of semi-alertness, a low-grade readiness that was draining over weeks and months. This was a life of distributed, chronic anxiety, where the front line was one's own threshold, and the armor was a leather apron and a tired expression. The innovation here was not in technology, but in behavior. It was in the way a path was chosen to avoid a stretch of woods, in the way valuables were hidden in a hollow tree or beneath the floor of the pigsty, in the way children were taught to run to a specific hiding place at a specific signal. This was tactical thinking on a microscale, the design of a life to minimize exposure to a world of unpredictable harm. It was not recorded in manuals, but passed down through habit and grim anecdote. As seasons turned, the nature of the problems shifted, but the pattern of iterative response remained. The introduction of the crossbow was one such pivot. It was a machine that democratized force. It required less training than a longbow, and its mechanical advantage allowed a user to store immense energy, to be released with the simple squeeze of a lever. Changed equations. A man in expensive armor, the product of hundreds of hours of skilled labor, could be neutralized by a commoner who had practiced for a week. The social disturbance this caused was as significant as the tactical one. The ruling classes condemned it as unchivalrous, as cowardly. Their objections were a precise catalogue of the threat it posed to the established order. The Church at times sought to ban its use against Christians. These were the protests of a system whose logic was being undermined by a simpler, more efficient logic. The response, as always, was adaptation. Armor grew thicker in specific places. Shields became larger, evolving into the pavis, a portable wall behind which a crossbowman could shelter while reloading. The battlefield stretched. Engagement distances increased. The safe space behind the lines shrank. Warfare became, in some ways, less personal and more statistical. The crossbowman did not see the face of the man he shot. He aimed at a shape, at a glint of metal. He worked his mechanism, loaded, aimed, and released as part of a collective action. A volley meant to soften the enemy before the closer work began. The psychological effect was profound. The whir and thud of a bolt striking a shield or embedding itself in the ground nearby was a constant, random punctuation to the waiting. It made the approach a gauntlet, a test of nerve as much as of armor. The man inside the metal shell had to walk toward that danger, had to accept that at any moment, luck might place a bolt in the one imperfect gap in his defense. This waiting, this advance under a silent rain, was a new form of torment. A stretched time out made every step a conscious act of will. The creativity of the weapon was not in its form, but in the new behaviors and fears it imposed on the world. The night before such an engagement was its own special kind of stillness. In the camp of the common infantryman, the mood was somber. There was less of the night's ritual preparation, the confession, the polishing of heraldry. There was instead a practical, grim focus. Men checked the strings of their crossbows, ensured their windlasses worked smoothly, counted their bolts. They ate their simple rations without tasting them. They wrote letters they knew might never be sent, or simply sat, staring into the fire, conserving the energy they would need for the morrow's slow, dangerous advance. They knew their role. They were not the heroes of the songs. They were a pressure, a hazard, a statistical force meant to degrade the enemy's will and numbers. Their fear was not of dishonor, but of pain, of crippling injury, of leaving a family with no provider. Their courage was a quieter variety, born of necessity and the solidarity of the men standing next to them. They spoke little of glory. They spoke of home, of mundane things, of a good harvest or a bad landlord. Their conversations were an anchor to a world where things grew from the ground and were not broken upon it. As the night deepened, they would try to sleep, huddled together for warmth, their weapons close at hand. Their rest was fitful, haunted by the anticipation of the signal to form up, to begin the long, slow walk into the field of controlled danger. The night birds called. The wind rustled the grass. The ordinary world continued, oblivious to the human designs layered upon it. In these hours, the grand strategies of lords and the iterative designs of weaponsmiths dissolved into the simple, animal reality of men waiting in the dark, hoping to see another dawn. The problem was no longer abstract. It was the dryness in the throat, the chill in the bones, the knot of tension in the stomach that refused to unwind. The solution, for these hours, was merely to endure, to breathe, to exist until the sun rose and the next phase of the relentless, adaptive cycle began again. The dawn, when it came, was rarely dramatic. It was a gradual graying of the world, a slow seep of light that drained the stars and gave form to the mist hanging over the fields. In the camps, the silence of deep night gave way to the low sounds of waking. The coughs, the rustle of straw or blanket, the clink of a canteen. Men rose stiffly, their bodies protesting the cold ground and the weight of the coming day. There was a routine to these hours, a sequence of small, practiced actions that served as a bulwark against the chaos to come. Fires were stoked from embers. Water was heated for a thin gruel. The process of donning gear began, not the full panoply of the knight, but the simpler, no less vital kit of the infantryman. Padded jack was laced tight. A helmet, perhaps just a simple steel cap, was settled onto the head. A sword belt was cinched. For the crossbowman, there was the methodical checking of his weapon once more, the winding of the string, the careful placement of a dozen bolts in a quiver where he could reach them by touch. This preparation was meditative. Each buckle fastened, each strap adjusted, was a small claim of order, a ritual that said, "I am still here, and I am preparing to continue to be here." The conversations, if any, were muted, focused on the immediate. The condition of the ground after the night's dew, the rumor of the enemy's position, the hope that the supply wagons would be up soon. There was no grand speech, no stirring call to arms. The motivation was internal, built from the accumulation of these mundane acts, from the shared, unspoken understanding that the group would move forward because to stay still was to admit a kind of defeat before the first blow was landed. As the light strengthened, the field of battle revealed itself not as an abstract chessboard, but as a specific piece of geography with its own personality. A gentle slope meant an uphill march for one side, a draining of energy before contact. A patch of woods on the flank was a place of potential ambush, a seam in the planned order. A stream, seemingly minor, could become a treacherous obstacle if its banks were muddy. Commanders on horseback would survey this terrain, their eyes reading it for advantage and risk, but for the man on foot, the view was simpler, more visceral. He saw the distance he would have to cross. He saw the dark mass of the enemy formation on the far side, a bristling, indistinct line that seemed to waver in the morning haze. The space between the two forces was not empty. It was a theater of possibility, a width of land that would soon be measured in paces, in breaths, in the increasing proximity of threat. The order to advance would ripple through the ranks, a quiet cascade of murmured commands. And then the movement would begin. It was not a sprint. It was a slow, deliberate walk, a collective willing of bodies forward into that open space. The rhythm of the march was set by the slow drum or the simple necessity of keeping the line. It was in this walking, this long approach, that the psychological work of the weapon was truly felt. With every step, the enemy line grew larger, more detailed. You could begin to see individual banners, the glint of spear points, the shapes of men who were, until this moment, abstractions. The mind, left with nothing to do but observe this closing distance, would begin its own assault. It would calculate odds. It would imagine the moment of impact. It would flinch at imagined arrows, though none had flown. This was the true purpose of the terrifying weapons, the spiked balls, the hooked bills, the morning stars. Their reputation preceded them. The knowledge that such things waited in that line ahead made the walk an exercise in sustained dread. The creativity of their design was thus twofold. They were tools for breaking bodies, but first they were tools for breaking nerves. They solved the problem of a determined enemy by introducing the corrosive element of imagination into the long minutes before contact. When the distance closed to the range of the crossbow, the walking would stop. Command would be given. The front ranks would kneel, presenting a wall of shields. The crossbowmen behind them would step forward, level their weapons. There was a pause, a collective intake of breath. Then the release. The sound was not a single note, but a ragged chorus of thwacks and whirs as dozens of strings were loosed. The bolts became a dark swarm, arcing up and then descending into the enemy formation. The immediate result was often invisible from the shooting line, but the sound told a story. The solid thump of a bolt striking a shield, the higher-pitched crack of one hitting wood, and occasionally, a sharp cry that pierced the general din. Then the crossbowmen would step back, behind the shield wall, and begin the laborious process of reloading. This was their moment of maximum vulnerability, and it required a drilled precision. The windlass was fitted, the crank turned, the string drawn back and locked. A new bolt was taken from the quiver, placed in the groove. During this half-minute or more, the world narrowed to a tunnel of focus motion. The noises around, the shouts, the screams, the impacts of return fire on the shields, became a muffled backdrop. The task was everything. It was a mechanical prayer for enough time to complete the cycle before the order to shoot again, or before the enemy decided to advance into the reloading interval. This punctuated rhythm, advance, stop, shoot, retreat, and reload, defined the early phase of many engagements. It was a slow, grinding exchange of material and luck. Men fell not in heroic duels, but to anonymous, airborne pieces of wood and iron. They were pulled back through the ranks, their places taken by others. The line would compress, reform, hold. There was no dramatic charge, just this methodical, brutal trade. It was problem-solving of the coldest kind, applying a ranged tool to reduce the enemy's numbers and morale before the more expensive, close-quarters work became necessary. The creativity here was logistical, a matter of timing, spacing, and the management of fear under a rain of return fire. If the ranged exchange did not break one side, the lines would eventually converge. This was the moment the armor was truly meant for, the moment the hours at the forge and the years of training were put to the test. But the reality of the press was far from the idealized duel. The initial crash of the front ranks was a shock of noise and impact, a shudder that ran through both formations. Then the battle dissolved into 1,000 individual struggles within a terrifyingly compressed space. The neat lines vanished, replaced by a seething scrum of men. Here, the longer weapons, the poleaxes, the halberds, the bills came into their own. Their extended reach was not for elegance, but for survival. A man with a spear could threaten an opponent who could not yet reach him. The goal was not a killing blow necessarily, but a creating of distance, a controlling of the space immediately in front. A hook on the back of a halberd could snag a leg, unbalance a man, pulling him down into the mud where he could be dealt with by those behind. The battlefield became a landscape of limited vision and overwhelming sensation. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, blood, damp wool, and the metallic scent of fear. The sound was a deafening roar, a composite of shouts, grunts of effort, screams of pain, and the endless, discordant clash of metal on metal and metal on wood. Within this chaos, the intricate design of a weapon could be rendered moot. There was no room for a full swing. Movements were abbreviated, thrusts made at half-arm's length. A dagger, often overlooked in tales of grand arms, became a supremely important tool for the intimate, final work. The armor that had been so carefully crafted now presented its own problems. A man knocked down might find it incredibly difficult to rise under its weight, especially if the ground was soft. He would become a turtle on its back, vulnerable to the downward thrust of a spear or the crushing blow of a mace. The fight was no longer about skill, but about leverage, position, and the grim endurance to keep pushing, keep striking, keep standing as the bodies pressed in from all sides. The iterative design met its ultimate test not in a laboratory, but in this hot, dark, suffocating press of humanity, where the only law was force and the only goal was to create enough space to take another breath. The duration of the press was not measured in minutes, but in the gradual accumulation of fatigue and the slow shift of the collective center of gravity. It was a contest of mass and will, fought in increments of inches. A formation would bulge inward, men at the back unconsciously leaning forward to support those in front, their boots slipping in the churned earth. The sound was less of individual clashes now, more a constant, deep groan. The strain of wood, the grinding of metal plates, the exhausted breaths of hundreds of men pushed to their physical limit. Within this, the individual experience became surreal, dissociated. A soldier might find his vision narrowing to the small patch of an opponent's helmet visor directly before him, the world beyond reduced to a blur of movement and color. His own breathing was loud in his ears, a ragged counter-rhythm to the thumping of his heart. The weight of his weapon, so familiar moments before, now felt like a leaden extension of his own aching arm. Thought retreated, replaced by a kind of automated persistence. Parry if there was room. Shove forward with the shoulder. Find a foothold. The sophisticated techniques drilled on the training field were irrelevant here. What remained were the primal motor patterns. Push, strike, resist. The armor, designed for protection, became a furnace. Sweat pooled, stinging the eyes. The padded gambeson beneath, soaked through, clung heavily, chafing with every movement. The great paradox of the protective shell was revealed in these moments. It saved the life within, but in doing so, it methodically exhausted it. A man could survive many blows, but each impact, even those that did not penetrate, transferred its energy into his body, a series of small, draining concussions. The fight became less about defeating the enemy in front of you, and more about outlasting the man opposite, about who would succumb first to the sheer, grinding physics of the situation. Then, somewhere in the line, a fracture would appear. It might be a single man stumbling backward, creating a tiny pocket of space. It might be a localized cry of panic, a voice breaking through the collective roar to signal a loss of nerve. This small failure of cohesion was like a crack in a dam. Pressure, both physical and psychological, would flood into that point. The line would bend, then buckle. What had been a shoving match would become a slow-motion collapse. For those in the failing section, the world inverted. The pressure from behind ceased, replaced by a terrifying sense of exposure. The enemy, feeling the shift, would push harder, their energy renewed by the scent of advantage. The order of the formation dissolved into a scramble. Turning to maintain a facing defense was often impossible in the press. Instead, the instinct was to give ground, to step back, to create enough distance to turn and run. But running in heavy armor on broken ground, amid a crowd of equally desperate men, was its own kind of nightmare. The mind, which had been subdued by fatigue, was now jolted awake by a sharp, clean spike of terror. The goal was no longer victory, but the recovery of enough space to breathe and flee. The weapons, once tools of aggression, became obstacles, things to be discarded if they slowed the retreat. A shield might be thrown aside. A polearm, too long and cumbersome, might be dropped. The only thought was the shedding of weight, the increase of speed. But the body, already depleted, often betrayed this command. Legs, heavy with lactic acid and strain, would not move with the speed the situation demanded. The retreat was not a sprint, but a staggering, clumsy rush, a fight against one's own equipment and exhaustion. For the side that had broken the line, a different phase began. The slow, collective pressure of the press gave way to the more dynamic, and often more lethal, phase of pursuit. This was where the mounted knights, held in reserve, might be unleashed. Their role was not to break the initial formation, that was the work of the infantry, but to exploit the break, to turn a retreat into a rout, to maximize the psychological and physical toll of the enemy's failure. The sight of heavy cavalry moving from a walk to a trot, then to a canter, lances coming down to a uniform angle, was a sight that could freeze the blood of even a disciplined soldier. For men already scattered, exhausted, and turned away, it was the embodiment of inescapable consequence. The ground would tremble with a new, deeper rhythm. The sound of hooves was a rolling thunder that drowned out all else. The pursuit was not a battle. It was an application of force upon a disorganized mass. The lance point, the sword swing from horseback, the trampling hooves, these were tools of harvest, reaping the yields of the earlier, harder-won breakthrough. The creativity here was tactical, a matter of timing and positioning. The weapon was the entire unit, the combined mass of man, horse, and steel acting as a single, terrifying instrument of shock and slaughter. For the fleeing man, the world reduced to a narrow tunnel aimed at the distant treeline, a stream, any conceivable cover. The sounds behind, the screams, the triumphant shouts, the relentless drum of hooves, were a wave pushing him forward even as his body begged to stop. This was the final, brutal efficiency of medieval combat, the systematic conversion of a tactical advantage into a catastrophic defeat. The tools and tactics had all been designed iteratively to create this precise moment, where resistance ceased and the only remaining problem for the victor was one of endurance in dealing death, and for the vanquished the bare arithmetic of survival. As the pursuit stretched and dissipated, the field was left to a new kind of quiet, one punctuated by the moans of the wounded and the calls of men searching for comrades. The sun, which had witnessed the entire slow unspooling of violence, would begin its decline, casting long, peaceful shadows across a landscape that was anything but. The victors, their adrenaline ebbing, would feel the return of their own fatigue, a deep, bone-level weariness that made the simplest tasks, unbuckling a helmet, sheathing a sword, require conscious effort. The process of accounting began. Prisoners were rounded up, their value calculated in potential ransom. The dead were stripped of anything valuable: armor, weapons, coins. This was not mere looting. It was the recycling of materials, the retrieval of the invested labor and capital from the field. A finely crafted sword was too valuable to leave in the hand of a dead man. A serviceable hauberk could be cleaned and worn by another. The iterative cycle extended even to the aftermath. What was lost by one side could be repurposed, literally, by the other, feeding the next round of the arms and armor race. The field itself was a workshop of salvage. Men moved through the twilight with the practiced detachment of scavengers, turning over bodies, assessing the condition of gear. It was grim, methodical work, conducted with a quiet efficiency that mirrored the earlier preparations. The emotional reality of the day was compartmentalized, set aside for the necessary business of recovery and consolidation. The night would come again, colder perhaps, and the camps would be quieter, the conversations more subdued, the sense of relief tempered by the knowledge that this was not an end, but a point in a continuum. The problem of the other had been addressed for today. But the world was full of others, and the logic of threat and response, of shield and spear, of armor and the tool made to defeat it, was a wheel that turned with the seasons. Tomorrow would bring its own needs, its own repairs, its own slow, deliberate preparations for the next iteration of the same fundamental human equation. The aftermath of the field was not a clean slate, but a landscape permanently altered, its soil holding the memory of the day. In the villages whose men had marched out, the waiting held a different texture. It was not the active anxiety of the camp, but a suspended quiet, a collective holding of breath. Work continued, the cows still needed milking, the field still needed tending, but it was performed with a distracted air. Eyes would drift toward the road at the edge of the village. Conversations would lapse into silence at the sound of an approaching cart. The creativity of this space was one of anticipation and dread, a mental rehearsal of potential futures. A wife would run through calculations. If he does not return, how long before the Lord Steward comes to adjust the rent? How much of the harvest can she and the children bring in alone? Where is the hidden pouch with the few small coins? These were strategic plans born of a different kind of survival, designs for enduring loss. The tools here were not of metal, but of social knowledge, of whispered agreements with neighbors, of understanding the grim arithmetic of feudal obligations. The night in such a village was profoundly dark. The hearth fires banked early to save fuel. The silence was heavy, waiting to be broken by the sound of returning footsteps, or to settle permanently into a new, emptier configuration. Back in the workshops of the town, the news from the field would arrive in fragments, brought by a limping survivor or a trader with a cartload of salvaged goods. This information was raw material as vital as iron ore. The blacksmith would listen not to tales of heroism, but to descriptions of failure. A sword that snapped at the hilt, a lance point that crumpled on a new style of plate, a helmet visor that was pierced by a particular type of arrowhead. Each failure was a problem to be solved, a flaw in the iteration. The smith's mind, trained to think in terms of stress and grain, would begin working immediately. He might take a bar of steel and begin folding it, not because he was told to, but because the rumor suggested a need for greater flexibility alongside hardness. The Fletcher, hearing of arrows shattering on improved armor, might experiment with different tips, bodkin points designed for penetration over cutting. This was research and development conducted in soot and sweat, funded by the urgent demand of demonstrated need. There were no prototypes in the modern sense, only the next batch of product, each one subtly different from the last, each a hypothesis about the nature of the next conflict. The workshop at night, after such news, was a place of contemplative labor. The master might sit by the dying forge light, turning a broken weapon over in his hands, his fingers reading the fracture lines like a priest reading auguries. His innovation was not born of inspiration, but of response. The world presented a new puzzle in the form of a broken man or a broken tool, and his craft was the slow, deliberate process of devising a stronger solution. For the wounded who returned, the battlefield did not end at the edge of the field. It traveled with them, in the form of a stiffened limb, a puckered scar, a persistent cough from a crushed rib. The body itself became a site of iterative repair, a project of lifelong management. Bones set by the camp barber might heal crooked, imposing a new, permanent geometry on a man's movement. The loss of a finger meant relearning the grip on a plow or a hammer. The mind, too, undertook its own repairs, often less successfully. Sleep might be fractured by dreams of the press, of the face that appeared in the visor slit a moment before the blow fell. A sudden loud noise, a door slamming, a blacksmith's hammer, could trigger a flinch so deep it felt instinctual. These men were living archives of the technology of their time. Their scars mapped the effectiveness of weapons. Their limps testified to the limits of armor. Their continued existence was a form of adaptation, a personal iteration where the goal was not victory, but a functional daily life carved out around the permanent changes wrought by a few hours of chaos. Their creativity was one of compensation. They might craft a special tool to accommodate a weakened hand, devise a new way to mount a horse with a stiff leg, learn to sleep propped in a corner where no one could approach from behind. Their solutions were private, undocumented, but no less ingenious for their small scale. They were engineers of their own diminished capacities, seeking the most efficient path through the remainder of their days. In the monasteries and scriptoria, far removed from the forge and the field, the conflict was processed through a different medium: ink and vellum. Monastic chroniclers recorded the events in a tone of dry inevitability, often attributing outcomes to divine will or moral failing. But within these records, nestled between the lines about kings and battles, were the mundane details that spoke to the iterative reality. An entry might note a particularly harsh winter that delayed the movement of armies, thus affecting the timing of a campaign. Another might observe a disease that swept through a camp, a non-violent attrition that could be as decisive as any cavalry charge. These writers were observers of systems, of the logistical and environmental constraints that shaped human conflict. Their creativity was in narrative, in weaving the disparate threads of weather, disease, harvest, and human ambition into a coherent, if often moralizing, story. They were the archivists of the cycle, preserving not just the outcomes, but some of the conditions that led to them. In the quiet of the cloister, by the light of a single candle, a monk might ponder the repetition in his own annals, the same families rising and falling, the same disputes over the same strips of land, the same descriptions of famine and sword. His conclusion might be one of spiritual despair or hope, but the pattern he documented was one of a world solving and resolving the same material problems with only marginally different tools. And as the years turned, the iterations accumulated, slowly transforming the landscape of conflict itself. The castle, the ultimate expression of defensive iteration, evolved in direct dialogue with the tools meant to reduce it. Thicker walls were met with more powerful trebuchets. Higher walls prompted the development of taller siege towers. Machicolations were added to parapets to allow defenders to drop things vertically on sappers at the base. Every innovation in siegecraft prompted a counter-innovation in fortification, a concrete and permanent expression of the arms race. These structures were not built quickly. They rose stone by heavy stone over decades, each phase of construction informed by the latest lessons from some distant siege. A lord might return from a campaign and immediately order modifications to his own keep, having seen a new technique of mining or artillery. The castle was a fossil record of fear, its architecture a slow memory of past threats and anticipated future ones. Life within its walls adapted to its rhythms. The storing of vast quantities of food and water was a logistical art. The design of inner courtyards and wells was a matter of survival during prolonged investment. The castle was not just a fortress. It was a designed ecosystem for enduring threat, a manifestation of the defensive mindset rendered in mortar and rock. Its shadow over the surrounding countryside was long, a daily reminder of the hierarchical order and the potential for violence that sustained it. Through all this, the field, the workshop, the scarred body, the written record, the rising stone, the cycle turned. It was driven by a cold, practical logic. A thing exists, poses a problem. A solution is crafted. That solution, in turn, becomes a new thing that poses a new problem. There was no endpoint envisioned, only the continual, grinding process of adaptation. The nights were long, and in the dark, by forge light, candlelight, or hearth light, the work continued. Sometimes it was the physical work of repair and preparation. Sometimes it was the mental work of planning and remembrance. Sometimes it was simply the work of waiting, of enduring the silence that held within it the echo of past clamor and the seed of future strife. The pace was slow, measured in seasons and generations, not in seconds. The emotions were muted, flattened by necessity and repetition. There was no grand finale to this process, no moment where the perfect weapon or the perfect defense ended the conversation. The conversation was the condition, the solving was the life, and as one night gave way to another gray dawn, the only certainty was that the work, the slow, iterative, unceasing work of solving the problem of the other, and through it, the problem of the self, would continue. The tools might change their shape. The materials might improve. But the fundamental equation remained, waiting in the quiet for the next turn of the wheel. The seasons themselves became participants in the cycle, their rhythms dictating the tempo of threat and preparation. Spring was not merely a time of planting, but a season of assessment and repair after the stagnation of winter. Roads, turned to quagmires by thaw, had to be made passable for the movement of men and carts. Winter's grip on stone and mortar would reveal new cracks in castle walls, necessitating the labor of masons who thought in terms of load and compression. The quality of the winter's forage would be known in the condition of the horses. A thin, weak animal was not a weapon, but a liability. Summer, for all its abundance, was a season of simmering potential. Fields ripening represented wealth, and wealth represented a target. Patrols along borders might increase, not to fight, but to be seen, to project a presence that factored into an enemy's calculations. The long daylight hours were for training, for the repetitive drilling of formations in fields outside town walls, turning individual men into components of a larger machine. The creativity here was in the transformation of chaotic human movement into predictable, controllable patterns. The commands were simple, designed to be heard over din. The maneuvers were basic, meant to be executable by tired, frightened men. It was a design problem of human behavior, solved through monotony and repetition until the correct response was deeper than thought. Autumn was the season of decisive punctuation. The harvest was in freeing men and animals from agrarian labor and providing the surplus calories to sustain them on campaign. The weather was still tolerable, the ground firm. It was the logical time for the unresolved tensions of the year to be settled, for the iterative preparations of spring and summer to be tested. The movement of an army in autumn was a vast, slow organism crossing the landscape. Its path was not random. It followed river valleys for water, sought out known fords, avoided forests that could mask ambush. Its pace was set by the crawl of ox-drawn supply wagons. This was warfare as a branch of logistics, a contest of supply lines and marching endurance as much as of arms. The army's very existence was a tool, a physical argument moving through territory. Its goal was often not the climactic battle, but the siege, the slow, methodical application of pressure to a fortified point, an attempt to solve the problem of the wall through patience and attrition. The camp outside a castle walls became a temporary, hostile city, its own routines established. The digging of latrines in a specific pattern to avoid disease was a tactical decision. The felling of trees in a particular direction to create abatis for defense was an act of engineering. The siege was a total design project, encompassing everything from the construction of enormous wooden engines to the management of boredom and morale among the besiegers. It was a grinding, undramatic process, where the most creative act might be the digging of a mine beneath a tower, a silent, claustrophobic war fought in darkness and dirt, far removed from the sunlit clashes of the field. Winter, when it returned, enforced a pause, a freezing of the cycle. Campaigns stalled. Armies dissolved back into their component parts. Knights returning to manor houses, peasants to their frozen fields. But the pause was not an end. It was a period of integration and reflection. The experiences of the autumn campaign were absorbed. A lord in his hall, his legs stretched toward the great fireplace, would replay the season's events in his mind. The performance of a vassal, the reliability of a mercenary captain, the behavior of a new type of saddle in wet conditions. These were data points. In the workshop, the smith had time for projects not driven by immediate demand. He might experiment with a new technique for laminating steel, a process requiring quiet, sustained focus impossible during the busier seasons. The farmer, mending tools by his own hearth, might carve a longer handle for his billhook, not because he planned to fight, but because the motion felt right, storing a little more force for the swing. This low-grade, distributed innovation was the bedrock of the iterative process. It was not centralized. It emerged from 1,000 points of practical engagement with the material world, slowly altering the technological ecosystem. Through the years, the human landscape changed with the physical one. A village repeatedly raided might be abandoned, its fields slowly reclaimed by forest, its stone foundations becoming a hazard for plows a generation later. A town that thrived as a supply hub for campaigns might grow, its walls expanding in concentric rings, each new circuit a fossilized record of a period of increased threat and prosperity. Trade routes shifted to avoid zones of perpetual conflict, channeling wealth and ideas along new paths. The very language adapted. Terms for specific pieces of armor, for siege techniques, for types of mercenary contracts entered common parlance, then faded as the things they described evolved or became obsolete. The culture was steeped in the reality of the cycle. Songs told not of clean victories, but of long absences, of betrayed trusts, of the grinding weight of armor. Religious iconography emphasized martyrdom and patient suffering, providing a spiritual framework for enduring the relentless, worldly pressure. The stories told to children held lessons about caution, about reading the intentions of strangers, about the value of a well-maintained gate. And in the deepest nights of winter, when the cold was a physical presence in the room and the world outside was a monochrome of white and black, the sense of time could distort. The past year's campaign felt simultaneously immediate and distant, a vivid dream. The anticipation of the spring's labors was a dull pressure on the horizon. In this suspended state, the mind could wander the entire cycle, not as a participant, but as a detached observer. It could see the peasant sharpening a tool, the knight polishing a blade, the mason fitting a stone, the chronicler dipping his pen, not as isolated acts, but as threads in a single, endless tapestry. The purpose was not progress toward a shining future, but the maintenance of a precarious equilibrium. The goal was continuity. The enemy was entropy. The entropy of a rusting sword, a crumbling wall, a fading alliance, a forgetting of hard-learned lessons. The creativity was in the constant, quiet labor of repair and reinforcement, of remembering what broke last time and trying to make it stronger, knowing perfectly well that this new strength would simply define the shape of the next breaking. It was a worldview devoid of utopia, but rich in grim, practical competence. The night would eventually end. The ice would melt. The roads would open. And the great, slow, iterative machine of threat and response, of problem and solution, would creak into motion once more, not with a shout, but with the simple, inevitable sound of a man buckling on a familiar weight, taking a first step onto a muddy path, and walking toward the next version of a very old problem. The rain, when it came, was a neutral actor in the cycle, yet it shaped everything. A steady, cold rain on the march turned wool cloaks into leaden shrouds, soaked through padding until it chafed the skin raw, and transformed paths into slick channels of mud that stole boots and sapped the will with every sucking step. It muted sound, turning the clatter of gear into a dull, wet jangle, and it limited vision to a gray, shimmering curtain. In such conditions, the technological advantages of fine steel or clever armor geometry were leveled by the elemental. A knight was as miserable as a foot soldier. The rain found every gap, every imperfect seam, tracing cold lines down the spine and pooling in the joints. It rusted metal with a silent, relentless patience, forcing men to the endless, thankless task of drying and oiling their tools each evening, a race against decay that was often lost. The creativity demanded here was of a personal, immediate kind: how to keep tinder dry, how to rig a shelter from a cloak and a spear, how to prevent the bowstrings from going slack. It was a problem-solving that returned to the most ancient human dialogues with the environment, a reminder that before one could solve the problem of the other, one had to solve the problem of the wet, the cold, and the dark. In the castles and fortified manor houses, the rain played a different role. It drummed on slate roofs and poured from gargoyle mouths, filling cisterns, a vital consideration for a siege. It tested the work of masons, revealing leaks in roofs or weaknesses in mortar where water seeped through to stain interior walls with ominous, spreading blooms of damp. The indoors became a world of firelight and shadow, the hearth the central sun of a small universe. Here, the maintenance was intellectual and social. Maps might be consulted, their vellum growing soft in the humid air. Accounts were reviewed, the financial underpinnings of future campaigns tallied in columns of faded ink. Alliances were tended through correspondence, the writing of letters a slow, deliberate craft where every phrase was a carefully placed stone in a wall of obligation or persuasion. The weapon here was language, wielded with a precision akin to a swordsmith's hammer. A poorly chosen word could be as damaging as a weak weld in a blade, causing a friendship to fracture under pressure. The Lord's court, confined by the weather, became a microcosm of larger politics, with its own subtle contests for favor and influence, its own silent assessments of strength and loyalty. The rain outside enforced a kind of simmering introspection, a time for the strategic mind to work without the distraction of action. For the vast majority who were not lords or soldiers on the march, the rain meant a retreat into the rhythms of cottage and workshop. The blacksmith's forge hissed and steamed as rain leaked through roof thatch, but the heat within created a dry cocoon. The work here became more focused, interior. A sword might be left for a day when the quenching water wouldn't chill it too rapidly. Instead, the smith might turn to the making of nails, hinges, or plowshares, the unglamorous, essential infrastructure of daily life that continued irrespective of wars. Each nail was a tiny, identical solution to the problem of joining wood to wood. Their production was hypnotic, a rhythm of heat, hammer, and toss into a bucket that could fill hours with a monotonous, almost meditative cadence. In the weaver's cottage, the click-clack of the loom was a constant counterpoint to the patter on the roof. The cloth produced might become a soldier's tabard or a monk's habit, the end use irrelevant to the mechanical process of interlacing thread. This was creativity stripped of any intent beyond creation itself, a pure expression of turning raw material into a usable form. The mind could wander while the hands worked, dwelling on private worries or sinking into a state of blank tranquility, the outside world reduced to sound and the tactile feedback of the craft. As the rain eventually ceased, leaving a world washed clean and glittering under a fitful sun, the evidence of the pause was everywhere. Muddy ruts hardened into permanent grooves. Rust bloomed orange on unattended iron. The changed light revealed new details. A tree split by lightning on a nearby hill, a section of wall that had sagged further. The resumption of movement felt like waking from a deep sleep. Men emerged from shelters, blinking. The routines of camp life restarted. The gathering of firewood that was now sodden, the attempt to cook over sputtering flames. The pace was slow, reluctant. The interruption had allowed fatigue to sink in deep, and the body resisted the return to effort. Yet the structure of the purpose remained. Orders were given, understood, and executed with a weary automaticity. The column reformed on the road, its progress slower, more ponderous. The iterative process adapted to this too. Plans made in the dry had to be adjusted for lost time, for spoiled supplies, for the lowered morale of damp men. A commander's creativity was tested not in grand tactics, but in the management of friction, in the unheroic calculus of whether to push exhausted troops another 5 miles or accept the risk of camping in a less defensible location. And through it all, the night continued to be the great regrouping, the daily aftermath. Whether in a campaign tent, a castle chamber, or a peasant's hut, the dark hours were for the body and mind to perform their own repairs. Sleep was the primary technology of recovery, but it was not always granted freely. Pain from old wounds could throb in the cold. Anxiety about the next day could coil in the stomach. The mind, freed from the day's demands, would sometimes replay its catalog of fears and failures with brutal clarity. To combat this, rituals developed. The checking of gear one more time, the whispering of prayers into the darkness, the focused regulation of breath. These were personal iterations, attempts to solve the problem of consciousness, to quiet the internal noise enough to secure the few hours of oblivion necessary to function again at dawn. The quality of the night's rest became a strategic resource as critical as grain or arrows. An army of sleep-deprived men was a brittle instrument. A lord who lay awake scheming might make poorer decisions come morning. The quest for rest was itself a silent, universal campaign. The cycle, viewed from this granular, weather-beaten perspective, lost any semblance of grand drama. It was a composite of millions of minor adjustments, discomforts endured, small tasks completed, moments of fear weathered, and fragments of rest stolen. The weapons and armor were merely the most visible tokens in this vast exchange. The true creativity was systemic, embedded in the social structures, the habitual behaviors, the shared knowledge of how to get through the rain, the march, the siege, and the night. It was a culture that had optimized itself not for happiness or peace, but for resilience, for the capacity to absorb shock, to repair damage, and to continue the pattern. There was no finale to work toward, no point at which the last problem was solved. There was only the constant, low-grade labor of maintaining the system against entropy and threat. The sound of this labor was not the clash of armies, but the sigh of a man settling onto a straw pallet, the scrape of a knife on whetstone, the hiss of rain on hot forge, the scratch of a quill in a ledger. It was a symphony of perseverance, playing on an endless loop, its movements defined not by crescendo and resolution, but by the slow, inevitable turning of the earth through seasons of sun and rain, growth and decay, conflict and the fragile, temporary ceasefires of the dark. The forest existed as a separate logic within the world of open fields and stone keeps. It was a place of different sounds, the creak of ancient boughs, the rustle of unseen creatures in the undergrowth, the distant, hollow knock of a woodpecker. Its light was filtered, dappled, and perpetually shifting. To move an armed force through dense woodland was to dismantle it. The formations so carefully drilled in clearings became impossible. Men moved in single file or small clusters, their world shrinking to the back of the man in front and the close press of foliage on either side. Communication was reduced to hand signals and the soft call of bird imitations. The forest did not favor the heavily armored. A low branch could catch a helmet, snapping the neck back. Thick brush could entangle a sword scabbard or the straps of a shield. The mud here was deep, leaf-choked, and hidden under carpets of moss. The creativity demanded by the forest was one of miniaturization and silence. Weapons adapted: shorter swords, axes that could clear brush as well as split skulls, bows that could thread arrows through narrow gaps in the trees. Armor was often shed for padded jacks or tough leather, trading absolute protection for mobility and the reduced noise of cloth on leaf. The forest was a realm of ambush and counter-ambush, where the iterative process accelerated into moments of sudden, terrifying violence. An attack would come not as a crashing line, but as a series of isolated, sharp eruptions. A cry cut short, the thrum of a bowstring from nowhere, then silence again. The problem to solve was not a wall of men, but the uncertainty of the space between trees. Solutions were sensory: learning to read the warning calls of birds, to distinguish the smell of a cold campfire from a fresh one, to see the broken twig or the misplaced stone. It was warfare reduced to its most primal, hunter and hunted level. A centuries-old game where the stakes were immediate oblivion and the only innovation was in the refinement of patience and perception. Beyond the forest edge lay the marsh, a landscape even more indifferent to human designs. Here, the very ground was untrustworthy. What appeared solid could give way to sucking, knee-deep mire. Still water reflected a flat, featureless sky, disorienting and hiding depths. The air was thick with biting insects and the damp, sweet rot smell of decay. To bring an army here was an act of desperation or profound miscalculation. Heavy equipment was a death sentence. Horses were worse than useless. Movement was a slow, exhausting wrestling match with mud and water. The marsh defeated the core principles of organized violence. It scattered formations, immobilized cavalry, and turned the proud technology of plate armor into a leaden coffin waiting to be filled. The creativity it demanded was not of invention, but of avoidance. Paths known only to local guides became treasures more valuable than maps. The ability to move on lighter, flat-bottomed boats, or to fashion quick, temporary walkways from bundles of reeds, was the highest military art in such a place. The weapons of the marsh were simple and brutal. Long hooks to pull men from precarious footing, spears for thrusting downward into the muck where a fallen man struggled. It was an environment that humbled the complex with the elemental, solving the problem of the armored knight not with a better weapon, but with geography. A man claimed by the peat would vanish, leaving barely a ripple, his expensive gear slowly sinking into the anaerobic gloom to be preserved, not for reuse, but for the distant future's curiosity. The marsh was a patient, passive consumer of martial ambition. In contrast, the open sea was a realm of pure, unforgiving physics. The castle's analog here was the ship, a wooden shell holding air and order against a vast, liquid chaos. The iterative design of the vessel was a direct response to the problems of wind, wave, and an enemy doing the same. Hull shapes evolved for speed or stability or cargo capacity. Rigs grew more complex to capture the wind from more angles. The weapons were extensions of the ship itself. The ram at the prow for punching, the castle structures fore and aft for height advantage, the corvus for boarding. But the true enemy was always the water. A storm was a siege against which there was no fortification, only seamanship. The learned, instinctive creativity of knowing when to reef a sail, how to ride a swell, which course might offer a sliver of lee. Naval warfare, when it occurred, was a claustrophobic horror of fire, splintering wood, and close-quarter slaughter on a platform that bucked and heaved. A man overboard in armor was a man already dead, his problem solved by the weight of his own solution. The sea accepted no tribute of ransoms. It streamlined the cycle to its essence. Adapt to the environment or be removed from it. The innovations of the shipwright and the navigator were among the most profound of the age, not because they served war, but because they expanded the very theater in which the human cycle of problem and solution could play out. At the farthest remove from these landscapes of overt conflict were the places of concentrated learning. The monastery scriptorium, the university lecture hall, the alchemist's cellar. Here, the problems were abstracted. The monk pondered the conflict between divine will and human suffering, seeking a theological solution to the fact of violence. The scholar debated Aristotle's theories of motion, which might one day indirectly inform the trajectory of a cannonball. The alchemist, amid his alembics and crucibles, sought the transformation of matter, his failures with mercury and sulfur slowly, accidentally, building a base of chemical knowledge. Their creativity was not iterative in the immediate practical sense. It was accretive, knowledge piled upon knowledge, often useless for generations, until a shift in context made it vital. The connection between the philosopher's speculation and the soldier's reality was attenuated, a thread stretching across decades or centuries. Yet this too was part of the cycle. The solving of abstract problems created a reservoir of potential solutions for the material ones. The mindset of analysis, of breaking down a complex whole into component parts, was the same whether applied to a theological paradox or the stress distribution in a curved plate of armor. The quiet of the cloister and the fury of the field were not opposites. They were different phases in the long, slow processing of the world's resistance to human understanding. And as the individual life spanned these realms, perhaps experiencing the forest as a youth on a hunt, the field as a man-at-arms, the sea on a pilgrimage, and the cloister in old age, the cyclical nature of it all could become a personal, felt truth. The problems changed their form, but the posture of addressing them remained. The body, once capable of enduring the long march, would later struggle with the simple problem of rising from a chair. The mind, once sharp for tactics, would turn its problem-solving inward, devising methods to manage the pain of gout or the loss of memory. The final personal iteration was towards stillness, a gradual disarmament in the face of the ultimate, unsolvable problem. The tools of this final phase were not swords or plows, but rosaries, regrets, and the careful distribution of possessions, a last attempt to order the world after one's own departure from the cycle. The world, of course, continued. The forests were cut back for fields, the marshes drained, the seas charted. New problems emerged from the solutions to the old ones. The castle, made obsolete by gunpowder, became a picturesque ruin, its iterative design frozen in time, a museum of outdated fear. The meticulous craftsmanship of the armorer gave way to the standardized production of the arsenal. The pace of iteration accelerated, but the pattern held. A new thing poses a problem. A solution is crafted. That solution becomes a new thing that poses a new problem. The settings changed from the muddy field to the smoky factory floor to the sterile lab, and the stakes scaled from the personal to the global, but the underlying engine, the restless human dialogue with a resistant universe, hummed on. The nights remained a constant in the variables, and in the dark, whether in a medieval camp or a modern city, the same fundamental work continued. The maintenance of the self and the society against the entropy of the morrow, the quiet, unending labor of preparation for the next turn of a wheel that had no end, only a perpetual, grinding, creative present. The passage of a single day, from its first gray hint to the final surrender to full dark, held within it a microcosm of the greater cycle. In the hour before dawn, the world was a study in monochrome. Shadows were deep and formless, sounds were isolated and magnified. The drip of condensation from a thatch eave, the cough of a sheep in a distant fold, the slow, deep breath of a sleeping man. This was a time of potential not yet directed. The mind, if awake, operated in a space between dream and plan, its thoughts unfixed and drifting. For the sentry on the wall, it was the coldest hour, his vigilance stretched thin by fatigue and the seductive pull of the fading stars. His creativity was a battle against his own biology, a willful focusing of attention on the gradual emergence of shapes from the gloom. A bush resolving from a shadow, the line of a fence becoming distinct. He was solving the problem of time, of filling the empty minutes with enough observation to justify his presence. With dawn came definition. Color seeped back into the world. The brown of wet earth, the gray-green of stone, the faded red of a painted door. Sounds multiplied and layered into the familiar tapestry of a community waking. The clatter of a bucket at a well, the scratch of a hearth fire being stirred to life, the low murmur of first conversations, still hushed by the remnants of night. This was the hour of first decisions, small but consequential. To light the forge now, or wait for a better wind. To take the sheep to the north pasture, or the west. To begin mending the fishing nets, or check the eel traps first. Each choice set a trajectory for the hours to come, a branching path of cause and effect that was the daily practice of iterative living. There was no fanfare. A man simply pulled on his boots, wrapped his belt around his tunic, and stepped out his door into the stream of the day's demands. The problems were known, their solutions worn smooth by repetition. The skill was in the sequencing, in the efficient ordering of tasks to conserve energy and material. As the sun climbed, the pace of problem-solving intensified, becoming more physical, more directly engaged with the stubbornness of matter. The farmer guiding his plow confronted the specific resistance of a root or a stone. His solution was a combination of applied force, a shift of weight, a muttered curse, and the patient, repeated passing of the blade until the soil turned over. The blacksmith, heating a piece of iron to a precise, glowing orange, judged the moment to strike by experience so deep it felt like sight. His hammer blow was a calculated transfer of energy, shaping the unyielding metal through a series of incremental persuasions. The baker, kneading dough, solved the problems of consistency and temperature through touch and smell, his craft a silent dialogue with living yeast. In each of these acts, the feedback was immediate. The furrow was straight or it was not. The metal took the shape or it cracked. The dough rose or it remained a dead lump. This was iteration in its purest, most satisfying form. Action, observation, adjustment, repeated until the task met the standard of good enough that allowed life to proceed. There was no perfection, only sufficiency. A slightly crooked furrow still grew grain. A sword with a minor flaw might still see a man through a fight. The quest was not for the ideal, but for the functional within the constraints of time, material, and skill. The midday sun brought a shift in tempo, a slowing born of heat and depletion. In the fields, men would find patches of shade to eat their simple meals, their bodies grateful for the pause. The focus turned inward to the management of the self. Thirst was quenched. A sore muscle was stretched. A blister was inspected. Conversation, if it occurred, was often practical, a sharing of observations about the work or the weather. This was the time for minor repairs to tools, tightening a loose axe head, rewrapping a worn handle with cord. It was maintenance within the day, a small-scale version of the larger cycle of wear and repair. The creativity here was in improvisation. Using a strip of leather when cord was lacking, employing a particular knot that held better, knowing a trick to sharpen a scythe with a smooth stone from the creek bed. These were the unrecorded patents of the common man. Small efficiencies passed from father to son, from master to apprentice, through demonstration, not documentation. They were the oil that reduced the friction of daily life. The afternoon was a long exhale, a pushing on through the gathering weight of fatigue. The quality of light changed, becoming thicker, more golden. Shadows stretched long across the ground. The work continued, but the sharp edge of morning's purpose was dulled. Mistakes became more likely. A tired woodcutter might misjudge a swing. A seamstress might prick her finger. The mind began to drift toward the evening, toward the promise of cessation. The problems of this hour were often about endurance, about marshaling the last reserves of will to complete the necessary tasks before the light failed. It was a psychological contest as much as a physical one. A man might break the remaining work into smaller, mentally manageable pieces. Just to the end of this row, just 10 more nails, just this last seam. This partitioning of effort was a cognitive technology for overcoming the self, a way to solve the problem of a body and mind that wanted to stop. Dusk was the great transition, the world's slow blink. Color drained again, but differently than at dawn. It faded into blues and purples, the world softening at the edges. The sounds of labor ceased, replaced by the sounds of conclusion. The shutting of a workshop shutter, the latch dropping on a stable door, the call of a child from a doorway. The problems now were of closure and security. Was the fire in the hearth safe? Was the livestock penned? Was the gate barred? These were ritualistic checks, actions performed not just for their utility, but for the psychological closure they provided. They were a line drawn between the productive chaos of the day and the vulnerable quiet of the night. Inside, by fire or candlelight, the final domestic iterations took place. A pot was stirred over the flames. A torn tunic was set aside for mending. The day's events were recounted in sparse sentences, processed into narrative, filed away in memory. This was the accounting, the summing up of the day's successes and failures, its small solutions and unresolved tensions. Then the final quiet. The fire burned low. The candle guttered. In the darkness, the only movement was the slow rise and fall of a chest in sleep, or the restless turn of someone wrestling with a thought that would not settle. The day's cycle was complete. All the solutions crafted, the straightened plow line, the forged hinge, the mended net, the managed hunger, the endured fatigue, had served their purpose. They had maintained the fragile equilibrium for another revolution. And as the individual consciousness faded into the blank repair of sleep, the larger world's cycle continued unimpeded. The stars turned. Animals moved through the forests. Rivers cut slowly at their banks. And the great, slow, iterative work of existence carried on, a process with no author and no end, only the perpetual, quiet, relentless turning from one problem to the next, from one solution to the new set of conditions it created, in an endless, rhythmic exchange with the dark. The texture of silence varied with the architecture that contained it. In the low, smoke-blackened rafters of a peasant's cottage, silence was a thin veil, easily pierced. It was filled with the settling of the wattle and daub walls, the scratch of a mouse in the thatch, the soft, congested breathing of a child, the deep, rhythmic snore of a spent body. This silence was communal, shared, a collective exhalation after the day's labor. It was not empty, but dense with the presence of others, with the warmth of bodies and the smell of damp wool and hearth ash. The problems suspended by sleep here were immediate and material. The worry over a dwindling grain sack, the ache in a joint from a misstep in the field, the unresolved tension with a neighbor over a boundary stone. The mind, even in rest, did not fully relinquish its grip on these things. They lingered at the edges of dreams, giving them a gritty, tangible quality. The creativity of the space was one of compression, of fitting lives, worries, and the raw materials of survival into a small, dark, warm box and finding, through sheer proximity, a way to endure until the light returned. In the stone vault of a castle's lower hall, silence had weight and coldness. It settled like dust on the long trestle tables, pooled in the corners of the cavernous room. The great hearth held only dead ashes, a mound of gray and white. The silence here was institutional, the quiet of power at rest. It was broken occasionally by the measured tread of a guard on the walls above, a sound that echoed down through arrow slits and stairwells, a reminder that the vigilance was structural, baked into the stone. The problems sleeping here were of a different scale. The management of distant estates, the loyalty of a vassal whose eyes had shifted during the last council, the impending cost of marrying a daughter to secure an alliance. These were abstract worries, chess moves in a slow game. They generated a different kind of mental labor, less about physical endurance and more about the navigation of human complexity. The lord or lady lying in the chamber above might stare at the canopy of their bed, running through scenarios, parsing the meaning of a casually dropped phrase. The silence of the castle was not comforting. It was calculative. It was the sound of the machine of hierarchy idling, its gears still faintly ticking over, awaiting the fuel of daylight and action. Within the cloister of a monastery, silence was not an absence but a discipline. It was cultivated, enforced by rule and custom. In the dormitory, the only sounds were the rustle of a rough wool blanket, the creak of a straw mattress, the collective, whispered sigh of men breathing in unison. This manufactured quiet was meant to turn the mind inward, away from the sensory world, toward contemplation of the divine. The problems addressed here were eternal: the nature of sin, the path to grace, the interpretation of a cryptic passage of Scripture. The creativity was intellectual and spiritual, a relentless iteration upon theological concepts. A monk might spend years, a lifetime, circling the same idea, polishing it like a river stone, seeking a flaw in his own understanding or a new, shimmering facet of truth. The silence was the medium for this work, the clear, cold water in which the stone was turned. It was a problem-solving of the soul, where the feedback loop was not a straight furrow or a sharp blade, but a fleeting sense of peace, a momentary feeling of alignment with an ineffable order. The night here was not for forgetting the day's problems, but for confronting the fundamental ones that underpinned all others. Out on the open road, under a vast sky, silence was a vast, hollow thing. A traveler, wrapped in a cloak against the dew, lying in the lee of a hedge or under the skeletal branches of a tree, experienced silence as an immense presence. It was the absence of familiar sounds, the home sounds, the workshop sounds, the known sounds of a particular place. In their place was the wind moving through endless grass, the call of a night bird too distant to identify, the inexplicable crack of a cooling stone. This silence was isolating. It magnified small fears. Every rustle in the dark was a potential threat, and the mind, stripped of its daytime anchors, would diligently invent solutions to phantom problems. The placement of the dagger under the rolled cloak for a quick grip, the mental map of escape routes, the decision to feign sleep to draw out a hidden observer. The creativity of the road was paranoid and survivalist, a hypervigilant iteration on the theme of personal security in a landscape of unknowns. Sleep, when it came, was thin and alert, the body tuned like a lute string to vibrate at the slightest disturbance. The problems here were reduced to the binary of safe and not safe, and the solutions were all provisional, temporary arrangements with the threatening dark. And in the workshop, after everyone had left, when the last ember in the forge had been drowned and the tools hung in their places, a unique silence remained. It was the silence of spent potential, of energy recently converted into form. The air still held the ghosts of smells: hot metal, charcoal, tangy oil, the scent of the wood handle recently shaped. The quiet here was pregnant with the memory of noise, the ringing blows, the hiss of steam, the grind of the wheel. It was a creative silence, the echo of a process paused. The problem solved that day, the stubborn warp in a piece of stock, the challenge of fitting a complex joint, the quest for a specific edge hung in the air, settled now into the physicality of the objects left on the bench. A half-finished blade, a set of hinges awaiting mounting, a helmet visor with its sight lines not yet filed clean. These were questions in steel and wood, waiting for the mind and hand to return and continue the dialogue. This silence was not an end, but a comma. It was the respectful pause between iterations, where the crafted thing and the crafter both rested, gathering themselves for the next round of the persistent, intimate struggle to impose will upon a resistant world. In this dark room, the cycle was most clearly visible. A problem identified, a solution attempted, a new state of affairs achieved that would itself become the starting point for tomorrow's problem. The work was never done, only suspended, waiting in the quiet for the return of the light and the hand. The river was a different kind of cycle within the world, a moving road that imposed its own logic. Its banks were thresholds, neither fully land nor water, zones of soft mud and tangled roots. To cross a river was a significant event, a punctuation in a journey. A ford was a precious piece of common knowledge, its depth changing with the seasons and the rains. The problem of crossing invited solutions ranging from the simple, removing boots and wading with trousers rolled, to the complex, the construction of a raft from felled timber and rope, or the hiring of a ferryman who knew the currents. A bridge was a major feat of iterative engineering, each arch a hypothesis about load and flow, built upon the lessons of bridges that had collapsed upstream or down in years past. The river did not care about armies or lords. It would sweep away the knight and the peasant with equal indifference if they misjudged its strength. Its noise was a constant white roar or a soft gurgle, a sound that could mask the approach of men or the whispers of conspiracy. To travel by river was to surrender to a slower, drifting pace, a perspective that turned the landscape into a moving scroll. Castles on bluffs looked different from the water, their weaknesses and strengths revealed from this low angle. The creativity demanded by the river was one of fluid dynamics and patience. It taught a lesson in forces that could not be confronted head-on, only harnessed or avoided. In the high, thin air of mountain passes, the problems were of breath and footing. The cold was sharper, a physical presence that sought gaps in clothing. The wind had a voice here, a constant whine or roar through rocky defile. Paths were narrow, often just a shelf above a dizzying drop. Movement was reduced to a single file, a line of men and animals tethered together by shared risk and the rhythm of careful steps. The technology of the mountain was minimal. A good staff to probe uncertain ground, hobnailed boots for purchase on ice, perhaps a rope for the most perilous sections. The iterative process here was immediate and fatal. A misstep was its own solution, a sudden, irrevocable answer to the problem of balance. The mountain pass was a natural bottleneck, a place where the grand strategies of the plain were funneled into a desperate, scrambling effort to move from one side of a stone wall to the other. Ambush was a constant specter. A handful of men with rocks and bows could hold an army at bay. The creativity was tactical in the extreme, a matter of timing the passage, of sending scouts ahead to secure the heights, of moving at night when the cold was deadly but the enemy might be sleeping. The silence of the mountains was immense, a crushing weight that made human sounds seem tiny and absurd. It was a landscape that reduced concerns to the elemental warmth, stability, air, and the next safe place to rest. The town at night, once its gates were shut, became an interior world. The silence within its walls was a composite of 1,000 smaller silences behind shutters and doors. The watchman's call, marking the hour, was less a warning and more a reassurance, a proof that the system of vigilance was functioning. The problems here were civic and compact. A leak in the communal cistern, a dispute over the boundaries of a market stall, the slow spread of mold on a storehouse wall. These were issues managed by council and custom, solved through talk and tiny levies, through the careful, precedent-laden judgments of burghers. The creativity was bureaucratic, the slow, painstaking building of codes and agreements that allowed thousands of people to live stacked together without constant strife. It was a different kind of engineering, one of social contracts and shared walls. The night in the town also held the potential for a different kind of violence. Not the clash of armies, but the quiet crime. The cut purse, the broken lock, the assignation in a shadowed alley. The solutions to these problems were the night watch, the barred door, the loyalty of neighbors. It was a finer-grained, more intimate iteration of the security problem, played out in cobbled lanes instead of on open fields. Within the household, the smallest unit of the social order, the cycle was domestic and repetitive to the point of ritual. The problem of hunger was solved 3 times a day, with variations dictated by season, fortune, and the skill of the cook. The problem of dirt was met with the broom, the washboard, the endless carrying of water. The problem of wear was addressed with the needle and thread, the patch, the careful turning of a collar to hide fraying. This was the bedrock level of iteration, where the solutions were so ingrained they became invisible, the muscle memory of a culture. The creativity here was in the subtle variations. A different herb in the stew, a new stitch to reinforce a seam, a more efficient arrangement of pots by the hearth. It was innovation measured in saved seconds and reduced waste. The nights in the household were for the mending, both physical and social. Clothes were repaired by candlelight. The day's minor conflicts between children or spouses were smoothed over with a quiet word, or left to settle in the cooling air. The household was a factory for the maintenance of human life, its productivity measured in clean children, mended socks, and the preservation of a fragile peace within its own walls. It was the cell from which the larger body politic was built, and its relentless, quiet labor of solving tiny problems was what made all other, larger ambitions possible. And in the mind of the individual, lying awake in any of these places, cottage, castle, cloister, or under the open sky, the final, most personal iteration took place. The mind reviewed the day's catalog of solved and unsolved problems. It replayed conversations, searching for hidden meanings or missed opportunities. It rehearsed conversations yet to come, testing phrases, anticipating objections. This was the unseen labor of psychology, the iterative design of the self in relation to the world. A man might practice a look of confidence he did not feel. A woman might craft a story to explain a lateness or a loss. They were solving the problems of perception and social navigation. In the dark, freed from the need to perform for others, the mind could also turn to its deepest, most persistent puzzles. The nature of its own fears, the source of its recurring angers, the elusive path to contentment. These were problems with no clear solution, only a lifetime of slow, incremental adjustment. A little more patience learned here, a fear confronted there, a grievance slowly released. This was the interior forge where the self was the metal, the hammer, and the smith. The blows were the events of the day, the heat was the emotion they generated, and the desired product was a self that could withstand the next day's trials without breaking. It was the most fundamental iteration of all, the endless process of becoming, of adapting the psyche to the unyielding facts of existence. And whether this work was done in a spirit of prayer, of anxiety, or of simple, weary reflection, it continued each night, in the quiet, as essential and unending as the flow of the river or the turning of the stars. The external world presented its problems of sword and soil, of wall and wheel. But the internal world presented its own, and the solving of them, the slow, lifelong crafting of a durable self, was the silent, universal campaign that underlay all others. The concept of waste did not exist as an endpoint, but as a transitional state within the cycle. A broken tool was not trash. It was material awaiting reassembly. The snapped haft of a spear could be shortened into a tool handle, the metal head salvaged and reforged into a smaller blade or a set of nails. A worn-out wool tunic, too threadbare for wear, would be cut into strips for bandages, or felted for patching, or unraveled to reuse the yarn for darning other garments. The bones from the evening meal were boiled for broth, then carved into needles, toggles, or gaming pieces. Nothing was permitted a final rest if it held even a whisper of utility. This constant renegotiation with objects required a deep, intuitive knowledge of material properties. A carpenter knew which split in a piece of firewood meant it was only good for burning, and which crack could be worked around to yield a usable plank. This was creativity born of profound scarcity, a mindset that saw every fragment as a potential component in a future solution. The workshop floor was never truly clean. It was a landscape of potential, littered with metal snippings, wood shavings, and leather offcuts, each a candidate for reabsorption into the process. The act of throwing something away was an admission of a failure of imagination. Time itself was a material to be managed iteratively. It was not a uniform stream, but a substance with different densities. There was task time, measured in the completion of a specific chore. Chopping this pile of wood, weaving this length of cloth, walking to that village. There was sun time, marked by the passage of light across the floor, dictating when certain clothes work must cease. There was season time, the grand, slow wheel that governed planting, campaigning, harvesting, and hibernation. The problem was how to fit the necessary tasks into the containers of time provided. The solution was routine, a pre-iterated pattern that eliminated the need for daily decision-making about sequence. You rose at dawn and did X, then Y, then Z because that was the order that experience had proven most efficient. The creativity emerged in the interstitial moments, in the tiny efficiencies discovered. Carrying the kindling while going to the well so as not to make 2 trips, soaking the peas while mending the net so they would cook faster later. This was time management at the granular level, a life composed of countless small optimizations that together created the margin between sufficiency and shortfall. The mind became a skilled accountant of minutes and motions, its innovations invisible to the historical record but vital to the continuity of life. The body, too, was a site of iterative knowledge so deep it became instinct. The farmer knew the exact bend of his back that allowed him to sigh the field all day without crippling himself, a posture learned through years of incremental adjustment and pain. The blacksmith recognized the perfect heat for welding not by a color chart, but by a specific, shimmering quality in the air above the metal, a sight knowledge passed down through countless repetitions. The sailor could feel a coming shift in the wind through a change in pressure on his skin, or read the wave patterns for hidden shoals. This was data stored in the muscles and the senses, a library of physical solutions to physical problems. Training was the process of downloading this library from one body to another, not through words, but through mimicked action, through guided repetition until the student's body discovered the same efficient pathways. A master could not truly explain his skill. He could only create the conditions for the apprentice to iterate toward it himself. This corporeal intelligence was the true engine of the age. The design of a sword mattered little if the arm that wielded it did not understand, in its sinews and bones, the precise arc and follow-through that made it effective. The most elegant solution remained inert without the body program to enact it. Information traveled at the speed of a walking man, a trotting horse, or a sailing ship. This slow spread created a patchwork of localized iterations. A village might develop a superior method for binding a thatch roof, a technique that would take a generation to spread 20 miles. A weaponsmith in one town might stumble upon a slightly better tempering process, giving the local lord's men a small, temporary edge until the smith's apprentice moved away or the secret was stolen. Problems and their solutions evolved in relative isolation, then collided when armies met or traders gathered. These collisions were moments of accelerated iteration. A soldier facing a new type of helmet hook or shield design would have to adapt his fighting style in real time. If he survived, that adaptation became part of his own repertoire, to be passed on. This was evolution in a literal sense, the selective pressure of combat weeding out less effective techniques and technologies, while allowing the more effective to reproduce through imitation and capture. There was no central patent office, only the brutal, efficient market of survival that tested every innovation and propagated the winners, slowly, unevenly, across the map. And woven through all this, the reuse of materials, the management of time, the education of the body, the diffusion of knowledge, was the relentless, low-grade stress of uncertainty. Would the harvest be enough? Would the winter be mild? Would the Lord call for levies? Would the fever spread? This uncertainty was the background hum of existence. The solutions were not about eliminating it, which was impossible, but about building buffers against it. The extra bushel of grain stored in a hidden crock, the spare pair of shoes in the chest, the maintained relationship with a kinsman in the next valley who could take in the children if disaster struck. These were psychological and social iterations, designs for resilience. They required thinking several moves ahead in a game where the rules were constantly shifting. The creativity was in the hedging of bets, in the diversification of risk, in the cultivation of networks of obligation that could be called upon in need. It was a life lived in the subjunctive mood, always pondering what if, and devising small preparatory answers. This mental posture of precaution was as much a tool as the hammer or the loom. It was the software running on the hardware of society, a program written in the language of proverbs, folk wisdom, and hard-earned superstition, all aimed at navigating a world where the next problem was always waiting, unseen, beyond the horizon. The goal was not to solve everything, but to build a system, personal, familial, communal, that was robust enough to solve the next thing, whatever it might be, and the thing after that, in an endless twilight struggle against the entropy of a world that provided no guarantees, only opportunities for temporary, hard-won equilibrium. The quality of light was a master that dictated the terms of engagement. The flat, shadowless gray of an overcast day softened the world, blurring the edges of distant trees and making the stone of a distant castle seem to bleed into the low sky. In this light, colors were muted, sound carried differently, dampened by the thick air. It was a light for close work, for tasks requiring fine discrimination without glare, the sorting of seeds, the detailed carving of a button, the mending of a link in a chainmail hauberk. It was a neutral light, offering no advantage to hunter or hunted, making the world feel quieter, more introspective. Problems under the sky felt less urgent, more meditative. A farmer might pause, leaning on his hoe, and stare at the soil for a long time, thinking about drainage or rotation, his thoughts as diffuse as the light itself. The iterative process slowed, became more contemplative. A smith might delay a crucial quench, waiting for a shift in the humidity he could feel but not see. This was the light of patience, of solutions that required waiting for the right conditions, of understanding that some problems could not be forced, only accommodated. Then there was the blinding, vertical light of a summer noon. It hammered down, bleaching color from everything, creating pits of black shadow that were like holes in the world. This light was a violent clarifier. It showed every flaw, the crack in a wall, the rust on a hinge, the uneven stitch in a garment. It drove men and animals into what shade could be found, enforcing a siesta not of culture but of biological necessity. Work in such light was hazardous. The glare could hide a snake in the grass, disguise a dip in the terrain, make the judging of a molten metal's temperature treacherous. The creativity under this sun was about mitigation. Wide-brimmed hats were fashioned. Work schedules were shifted to use the cooler mornings and late afternoons. Whitewash was applied to stone and plaster to reflect the punishing heat. This light solved the problem of concealment. Nothing could hide in its stark honesty. But it created the new problem of exposure, of the body to heat stroke, of the eyes to damage, of materials to warping and drying out. The solutions were about retreat, about creating small pockets of defended shadow in a world turned hostile and bright. The long, low light of late afternoon was a goldsmith, gilding the world. It stretched shadows to grotesque, elegant lengths, turning a simple fence post into a stark black line across a field of glowing wheat. This light was rich, sentimental, forgiving. It hid grime and wear in pools of warm amber. It made the meanest cottage look picturesque, the rustiest armor seem burnished. This was the light of assessment, of review. A shepherd, bringing in his flock, could count them easily in this slanting illumination. A woman inspecting her vegetable garden could see the true health of the plants. The problems of the day were nearly complete. This light allowed for an honest accounting of what had been accomplished and what had been left undone. It was also the light of vulnerability. An approaching rider could be seen for miles, his silhouette etched against the glowing western sky. Sentries on walls would shade their eyes, peering into the glare, knowing this was the hour a clever enemy might choose to approach, hidden within the sun's fiery blind spot. The iterative response was one of heightened attention, a tuning of the senses to overcome the disadvantage bestowed by the beautiful, treacherous light. Twilight, the gentle dissolution of the day, was the most profound transition. The world did not simply darken, it changed its substance. Solid forms softened and merged. Sounds became isolated and significant, the closing of a shutter, the call of a goat, the first chirp of a cricket. This was the light of thresholds. It was the time to secure the animals, to bank the fire, to bar the door. The problems shifted from external production to internal security. Had everything been brought in? Is the path to the well clear of obstacles for a nighttime trip? Is the candle supply sufficient? This light demanded decisions that would lock in the conditions for the coming night. It was a creative period of final adjustments, of tying off the loose ends of the day. It was also a time of psychological shifting, a letting go of the day's ambitions and a steeling for the different challenges of the dark. The mind would begin its own ritual of closure, a mental checking of locks and latches, a rehearsal of the route from bed to door in absolute blackness. Twilight was the antechamber to the night's own distinct cycle of problems and solutions, a soft, blue-gray hinge between two different worlds of effort. And then the moon. Its light was not an absence, but a presence. A cold, silver wash that created a world of monochrome and deep, inky shadow, transformed the familiar into the strange. A known path became a ribbon of ghostly white between pools of blackness that could hide anything. It was a light for movement, but movement of a stealthy, uncertain kind. It revealed broad outlines but swallowed detail. A man could travel by it, but he could not read by it, nor could he perform any task requiring precision. His problems were those of navigation and interpretation. Was that a tree or a man? Is that movement in the hedgerow an animal or an ambush? The solutions were about enhanced listening, about trusting senses other than sight, about moving with a slow, deliberate quiet that respected the moon's deceptive clarity. It was also the light of illicit things, of secret meetings, of poaching, of stolen kisses. Its creativity was one of subterfuge, of using the pattern of light and shadow to conceal intention. For the century, the moon was a double-edged sword. It lit the field of approach, but it also silhouetted him against the wall for anyone watching from the dark. His iteration was a dance with the moving shadows, a constant slight adjustment of position to stay in the blind spots of the light. The moon did not solve the problem of the dark. It replaced it with a different, more complex puzzle of perception and concealment. A chessboard of silver and jet where every move had to account for the cold, silent witness overhead. The wind was an unseen sculptor, a persistent voice that shaped decisions both large and small. A constant, dry wind from the east could suck the moisture from a field, demanding earlier irrigation or the acceptance of a stunted yield. It carried dust that gritted in the teeth, fouled mechanisms, and seeped into stored grain. The solution was often architectural, the orientation of a house to present its smallest wall to the prevailing gale, the planting of a windbreak of cypress or willow, the design of a mill whose sails could be reefed or adjusted to harness the force rather than be shattered by it. In a siege, the wind direction decided the fate of fire arrows and the spread of plague-ridden corpses catapulted over walls. It was a variable that could not be controlled, only observed, predicted, and exploited. The creativity it demanded was meteorological, a reading of cloud shapes, the behavior of birds, the ache in an old injury, all synthesized into a guess about the wind's next mood. A commander who understood the wind could use it to mask the sound of marching troops, or to blow smoke into the faces of the enemy. It was a tool as real as any sword, but one that belonged to no one and could turn in an instant. Rain has been mentioned, but the absence of rain, the drought, posed a problem of a slower, deeper violence. It was not an event, but a deepening condition. The earth cracked in polygonal patterns, like a shattered mirror. Streams shrank to muddy trickles, then to chains of stagnant pools. Wells gave up bitter, scant water. The problem expanded daily, creeping from the fields to the pastures to the very drinking cup. Solutions became increasingly desperate. Deeper wells were dug, a backbreaking gamble with no guarantee of success. Crops were sacrificed to save orchards with deeper roots. Livestock were slaughtered early, their meat salted or smoked, a preservation of some value from animals that could no longer be fed. The social fabric strained under the pressure. Traditional rights to water sources were challenged. Theft of a bucket of water could become a capital offense. The iterative process here was one of triage and grim prioritization. What could be saved? What must be let go? The creativity was in the management of decline, in the invention of new, more brutal efficiencies to preserve the core of life until the skies relented. It was innovation born of pure deficit, a redesign of existence around the central, terrible absence of a single, ordinary compound. Fog was the great anonymizer. It erased distance and hierarchy. A castle on a hill became a vague, looming shadow, then vanished. A man 10 paces away was a blur, his identity and intent hidden. In fog, the world shrank to a small, damp circle of immediate perception. Sound was distorted, muffled, or carried in odd ways. A shouted command might be heard by the enemy and not by one's own men. The problems of navigation and identification became paramount. Travel halted. Patrols clung to walls or known paths, feeling their way. The creativity demanded was one of local knowledge and alternative senses. A guard might rely on listening for the jingle of harness or the crunch of a foot on gravel, sounds the fog could not wholly swallow. Messengers might be tethered together with rope to avoid becoming lost. Fog was the ally of the spy and the deserter, the cloak for the movement of small, determined parties. It neutralized the advantages of height, numbers, and ranged weapons, reducing conflict to the intimate, sudden clash of shapes materializing from the gray void. The solution to the problem of fog was often simply to stop, to wait it out, to concede the hours to the weather's whim. It enforced a pause in the human cycle, a forced idleness where the only work was listening and waiting, a reminder that the environment could, with a blanket of mist, bring all grand designs to a temporary, dripping standstill. The forest in winter presented a different set of constraints. The green, concealing canopy was gone, replaced by a skeletal lattice that offered little cover but let in the weak, cold light. Snow changed the acoustics, absorbing sound, creating a profound, crystalline quiet. Tracking became elementary. Every creature left a story in the white. The problem was no longer concealment, but exposure and thermodynamics. Heat leaked away into the still, frigid air. Metal became a danger to touch. Bowstrings lost their elasticity. The solutions were about insulation and conservation. Clothing was layered, moving away from the single thick garment to multiple trapped air spaces. Shelters were built smaller, tighter, with lower ceilings to hold warmth. Fires were banked not for light, but for survival through the long night. Movement was calculated in terms of caloric expenditure. Was the hunt worth the energy it would consume? The iterative knowledge of winter was about the body as a furnace, and fuel, both wood and food, as its essential feedstock. Warfare in this season was rare, a brutal affair of attrition where frostbite and pneumonia claimed more lives than blades. The creativity of winter was stark, focused solely on the maintenance of the vital flame within against the immense, indifferent cold without. It was problem-solving stripped to its barest, most biological essentials. And the night, again, always the night. But not all nights were equal. A moonless, overcast night was a true void, a blindness so complete it pressed against the eyes. In such darkness, the mind's eye became the only guide. Men moved by memory of a space, not by sight of it. The problem was disorientation, the loss of the spatial certainty that daylight provided. The solution was hyperfamiliarity with one's immediate surroundings, and the development of a non-visual map. 10 paces from the door to the well, the feel of the oak tree's rough bark on the left, the specific squeak of the third step on the stair. This darkness favored the defender in his fixed position, who knew every stone, over the attacker who did not. It was a time for sentries to stand shoulder to shoulder, listening to the breath of the man next to them more than watching, for watching was useless. The creativity here was auditory and tactile, a redistribution of sensory attention to compensate for the loss of the primary sense. It was a reminder that the human organism was a bundle of adaptive capacities, and that when one channel was closed, others could be iteratively tuned to a finer pitch. In this profound dark, the cycle of problem and solution turned inward, becoming a meditation on the body's own resources, on the ability to know a world by sound, by touch, by the pressure of the air on the skin, and by the detailed internal chart of a space memorized in the light, now navigated in the faith of that memory. The texture of waiting was its own distinct state of being. It was not idleness, but a form of suspended animation, a conservation of energy for a known future expenditure. Soldiers waiting to be called into the line stood in a loose cluster, their bodies leaning on spears, their eyes dull, seeing nothing. They were like tools laid out on a bench, their purpose clear but not yet activated. The mind during such waits did not engage with large thoughts. It retreated to the maintenance of small comforts. A man might adjust the fit of a glove, retie a lace, run a thumb over the familiar nicks in his sword's pommel. This was tactile reassurance, a silent iteration upon personal readiness. Conversations were sparse, functional. A comment on the weather, a shared piece of dried meat. The creativity of waiting was about managing boredom and dread, about partitioning the self into a part that remained alert for the signal and a part that was allowed to drift into a harmless stupor. It was a psychological skill, learned through repetition, to exist in this gray, featureless interval without unraveling. For the craftsman awaiting a crucial stage in a process, the cooling of a forge, the setting of a glue, the rising of a dough, the waiting was active, observant. His senses were tuned to subtle cues. The shift in the color of cooling metal from cherry red to dull gray, the smell of the glue reaching the right tack, the specific domed shape of the risen loaf. This was waiting as a component of the craft itself, a necessary pause where the material dictated the timeline. The creativity lay in the precise reading of these cues, an intuition built from thousands of previous iterations. To rush was to ruin. To delay was to weaken. The master knew not by clock, but by a synthesis of sight, smell, and an internal, patient rhythm. This kind of waiting was a dialogue with the process, a respectful silence held while the physical world completed its half of the work. In the sick room, waiting took on a heavier, more viscous quality. Time was measured in the interval between labored breaths, in the changing pattern of feverish sleep, in the slow draining of a cup of broth. The problems here were of palliative iteration, adjusting a blanket, offering a sip of water, changing a poultice. Each action was a tiny, hopeful adjustment to the environment of suffering, an attempt to impose a minute degree of order or comfort on a process that was fundamentally chaotic and beyond control. The creativity was one of compassionate observation and small, physical interventions. It was a problem-solving with no expectation of a true solution, only the mitigation of symptoms, the easing of a journey toward an inevitable conclusion. The waiting here was shared, a vigil where the passage of hours was marked not by productivity, but by the subtle, often cruel, changes in the condition of the loved one. It was a lesson in the limits of iteration, in the recognition that some processes move to their own terminus, indifferent to the small, caring adjustments made at the bedside. The prisoner in his cell experienced waiting as the essence of his condition. His world was reduced to a fixed set of stimuli. The patch of light moving across the floor, the sounds from the courtyard, the routines of his jailers. His problems were existential and minute. How to preserve sanity. How to mark the days. How to communicate. The solutions were mental iterations of astonishing complexity. He might create elaborate fantasies, replay memories in exhaustive detail, invent games using straw or dust. He might establish a ritual of exercise, of pacing a precise number of steps, turning at a specific mark. This was creativity born of absolute constraint, the mind's desperate, brilliant project to generate novelty and purpose from a void. The waiting was not for a known event, but for an unknown end: release, trial, execution. The problem to solve was the self under conditions designed to break it. The most profound iterations occurred here, in the dark, silent theater of the isolated mind, forging mental tools for endurance out of the raw material of thought and memory alone. And for the watchman, the scout, the lookout on the tower, waiting was the profession. His body was an instrument tuned to a single note: anticipation. He was solving the problem of the unexpected by expecting it constantly. His senses were filters, discarding the normal: the cry of the nightjar, the rustle of the hedge in the common wind, and flagging the anomalous. A break in the pattern. A light where none should be. A silence that was too deep. His creativity was one of pattern recognition and disciplined imagination. He had to envision the possible threats in order to recognize their precursors. He waited not passively, but with a taut, directed attention that was itself a form of action. The cold, the fatigue, the loneliness were problems to be iteratively overcome through small movements, through focused breathing, through the mental narration of his own vigilance. His success was measured in non-events, in the uneventful passage of the hours he guarded. His was a creativity that aimed for emptiness, for the maintenance of a quiet so profound that any intrusion would be a shocking violation. He waited for nothing to happen, and in achieving that, he fulfilled his purpose. In all its forms, waiting was the space between iterations, the deep breath before the next effort. It was not a blank, but a saturated field of minor adjustments, of mental preparation, of sensory calibration. It was where the lessons of the last action were absorbed and the possibilities of the next one were rehearsed. The world's great cycles of conflict and creation were built upon these countless, invisible periods of suspension, where human consciousness, in 100 different ways, learned the art of holding itself ready, of existing in the pregnant pause, solving the interim problem of how to be, simply be, until the conditions changed and the hands were called upon to move, the mind to decide, and the cycle to turn once more. The concept of home was not a static location, but a set of solved problems. It was the place where the firewood was split to the right size for the hearth, where the leak in the roof had been temporarily patched with a mix of clay and straw, where the worn spot on the threshold was known and stepped over without thought. Each object in its place represented a concluded negotiation with need. The hook by the door for the cloak, the specific crock for the salt, the notch on the bedpost where a candle could be safely set. This environment was a museum of personal iterations, a physical record of past inconveniences that had been identified and addressed. The creativity was cumulative, layered. A new solution did not erase the old one. It was added to the sediment of domestic knowledge. The home was a fortress against chaos, not built in a day, but through 10,000 small, deliberate acts of order imposed upon the persistent drift toward entropy. To enter, it was to step into a space where the majority of immediate problems were already in a state of managed truce, allowing the mind a rare luxury: the capacity to think beyond the next 5 minutes. Beyond the home's threshold, the path represented a different kind of solved problem. A well-trodden path was not just a convenient route. It was a consensus. It marked the collective decision that this particular sequence of footsteps, avoiding the boggy patch and the low-hanging branch, was the most efficient way to move between 2 points. Its existence saved each traveler the cognitive labor of renavigating the terrain. The path was iterative on a communal scale, worn smooth by repetition, its very presence a solution to the problem of individual disorientation and wasted effort. Where it forked, the decision points were often marked. A cairn of stones, a blazed tree signs left by previous solvers for those who would come after. The path was a slow, collective intelligence made manifest in dirt and stone, a primitive algorithm for movement through the world. The community well was another nexus of solved problems. Its location was a matter of geology and shared need. The mechanism for drawing water, a bucket on a rope, a windlass, a sweep, was a piece of engineered iteration, balancing ease of use with durability. The rules around its use, times for drawing, priority and drought, were social iterations, delicate agreements forged from past conflicts over this essential resource. To approach the well was to enter a web of solved problems. Technical, social, logistical. The act of drawing water was therefore not a raw encounter with nature, but the final step in a long chain of prior reasoning and agreement. The well did not just hold water, it held the memory of thirst and the agreements made to quench it collectively. Language itself was the ultimate iterative toolkit for solving the problem of other minds. Each word was a compacted solution, a agreed-upon symbol for a concept, object, or action that avoided the need for endless pantomime or pointing. Grammar was the syntax for combining these solutions into complex thoughts, warnings, requests, and stories. A shared dialect was a vast, invisible infrastructure of pre-solved problems of communication. A skilled speaker was not just using this toolkit, but iterating upon it in real time, crafting new combinations, employing metaphor to solve the problem of describing the unfamiliar in terms of the familiar. Silence, within a shared language, could itself become a sophisticated solution, a way to communicate disapproval, grief, or deep understanding without the clumsiness of words. The evolution of language was the slowest and most profound iteration of all. A collective project spanning generations to refine the tools for transferring the interior world of one mind into the interior world of another. And within the self, habits were the pre-solved problems of behavior. The way a man tied his boots upon waking, a specific pattern of loops and pulls, was a solution arrived at years ago and now executed without conscious thought. It freed his mind to consider the day ahead while his hands performed their memorized dance. Habits were cognitive shortcuts, neural pathways worn smooth by repetition. They were the internalization of iteration, the outsourcing of routine decisions to the automatic self. Good habits were solutions that reliably produced desirable outcomes, health, efficiency, social grace. Bad habits were solutions that had once served a purpose, perhaps to alleviate boredom or anxiety, but now persisted beyond their utility, creating new problems of their own. The lifelong project of self-management was, in large part, the iterative work of examining these ingrained solutions, reinforcing the beneficial ones, and attempting to rewrite the detrimental ones, a slow, often frustrating process of self-directed reengineering. Thus, human life at every scale was a landscape of frozen solutions. The home, the path, the well, the word, the habit, each was a standing answer to a question that had been asked and answered so many times it had ceased to be a question. This was the silent, accumulated capital of civilization. It allowed each new day to begin not at zero, not with the primal problem of shelter, water, and communication, but on a high platform built by the dead and the living. The new problems that arose, the unusual pest in the crop, the novel design of an enemy's fortification, the mysterious ache in the chest, stood out against this backdrop of the already solved. And the process of addressing them was always, inevitably, an addition to this landscape. A new tool was forged and found its place on the wall. A new path was beaten across a newly cleared field. A new word was coined for a new feeling. A new habit was formed to meet a new demand. Each solution, in turn, became part of the environment, the new normal, the foundation upon which the next generation of problems would manifest, and the next round of quiet, persistent, iterative human solving would begin. The cycle was not just one of conflict and weaponry. It was the fundamental pulse of existence, the endless conversion of the problematic into the procedural, the chaotic into the familiar, the effortful into the effortless, only to have the familiar reveal, in time, its own new seams of difficulty, prompting the hands and the mind to move once again. The sensation of touch provided its own ledger of solved and unsolved problems. The calloused palm of a laborer was a biological iteration, the skin thickening in precise response to repeated friction from tool handles, creating a living glove that muted pain and improved grip. This was the body solving the problem of its own vulnerability, adapting its very texture to the work required of it. Conversely, the soft, uncalloused hands of a scribe or a lady were solutions to a different set of problems. The need for fine motor control in guiding a quill or handling delicate needlework, where thickened skin would be a hindrance. The body itself was a document of its engagements, its scars topographic maps of past failures in defense, its toughened areas proofs of habitual pressure. The way a man walked, a slight favoring of the left leg from an old break, a rolling gait learned on shipboard, was a kinetic solution, a compensation etched into muscle memory to solve the ongoing problem of moving a body that was no longer perfectly symmetrical or whole. Taste and smell were chemical problem solvers, ancient sentinels. The sour tang of spoilage warned of bacterial conquest, solving the problem of identifying toxic food before it could cause harm. The smoky scent of a distant fire, carried on the wind, was data to be interpreted. A hearth, a wildfire, a village burning? The nose sorted the world into categories of safe and dangerous, edible and foul, familiar and alien. The creativity lay in the cultural overlay atop these base sensations. The development of spices and complex cooking methods were iterative solutions to the problems of blandness, preservation, and the disguising of slightly old meat. A cuisine was a cumulative technology of taste, a shared agreement on how to transform raw, often threatening, nature into predictable, comforting, and sometimes celebratory fuel. Hearing was the sense of time and hidden space. The regular drip of water in a cave measured a slow geological process. The changing song of birds marked the hours of the day and the seasons of the year. But more critically, sound solved the problem of the unseen. The snap of a twig in a silent forest, the muffled clank of metal from beyond a hill, the particular cadence of a cough from the next room, identifying the person and hinting at their health. In the dark or in fog, hearing became the primary map. The skilled listener could construct a mental image of events, the number of horses approaching, the weight and armament of the men walking, the mood of a crowd from the pitch of its murmur. The iterative refinement of this skill was a matter of survival for the scout, the sentry, the parent listening for a child's restlessness in the night. It was a creative act of sonic deduction, building worlds from fragments of noise. Sight, the dominant sense, was itself an iterative processor. The eye did not simply record. It sought patterns, it ignored the constant, it flagged the anomaly. A farmer surveying his field did not see every stalk. He saw the areas of different color, the patches of stunted growth, the telltale signs of blight or pest. His sight was trained, a visual vocabulary built over a lifetime to instantly parse health from sickness in his crops. A sailor staring at the horizon did not see a uniform blue. He read the subtle textures of the water, the shapes of clouds, the barely perceptible line that might be land or a brewing storm. This trained vision was a cognitive tool, a filtering system that highlighted problems and potential solutions in the visual field. The artist or the stained glass maker took this further, iterating upon perception itself, learning to see not just objects, but light, shadow, hue, and line, breaking the world down into components that could be reassembled into a new, persuasive reality on parchment or glass. And then there was the sense of proprioception, the body's internal sense of its own position and movement. This was the sense that allowed a man to walk without watching his feet, to reach for a cup in the dark and find it, to swing a hammer in a perfect arc through muscle memory alone. Its solutions were so seamless they were invisible. A stumble was a proprioceptive failure, a momentary miscalculation in the ongoing unconscious solve for balance and trajectory. The mastery of a physical craft, the blacksmith's swing, the archer's draw, the scribe's steady hand, was the iterative training of this internal sense, calibrating it to the tools and materials until the body knew the motions better than the conscious mind. This sense solved the problem of agency in a physical world, translating intention into fluid, effective action. When it worked perfectly, the boundary between thought and deed vanished. The solution was the action itself, effortless and exact. It was the most intimate form of iteration, the deep, silent conversation between the will and the flesh, refining movement into an answer to the perpetual question of how to impose order upon the self and, through the self, upon the world immediately within its grasp. Thus, the human encounter with reality was not passive. It was a continuous, multisensory audit. Each sense was a specialist department, gathering raw data and comparing it against vast internal libraries of past experience. A discrepancy, a new smell, an unexpected sound, a visual break in the pattern, a strange texture underfoot, registered as a potential problem. The mind then synthesized these sensory reports, cross-referencing them, running through its index of past solutions. Is that sound plus that smell a house fire? Is this visual pattern plus this tactile sensation a hidden animal track? The creativity was in the synthesis, in the leap from disparate sensory clues to a coherent diagnosis and a proposed action. This moment of judgment, repeated countless times a day, was the core of the iterative loop. It was a silent, rapid-fire process of matching new situations to old templates, and when no template fit perfectly, of improvising a new response based on the nearest available analogy. The senses were the scouts. The mind was the commander, making decisions in the field with imperfect information. Its success measured only by the continued, uneventful functioning of the body and the persistence of the small, managed world it called its own. The concept of enough was a shifting calculation, a mental fulcrum that balanced need against effort, risk against reward. For the farmer, enough was not a number, but a feeling, the weight of the grain sacks in the storeroom, the thickness of fat on the autumn hog, the depth of hay in the loft. It was a buffer against the unknown length and harshness of the winter. The problem was uncertainty itself, and the solution was a surplus, an answer formulated in bulk before the question of scarcity could be asked. This accrual required a daily iteration of deferred gratification. Not eating that egg today, but letting it hatch. Not selling that extra bushel now, but holding it against a higher price or a future hunger. The creativity was in the management of this margin, in the constant, subtle adjustments to consumption based on the perceived robustness of the reserves. A sense of enough provided a fragile peace, a temporary ceasefire in the war against want. For the warrior, enough was a matter of force and cessation. It was the point at which the enemy's will broke, when further resistance became more costly than surrender. This point was invisible and had to be felt in the tempo of the fight, in the sound of the enemy's cries, in the way their line began to fray. The problem was knowing when to stop applying violence, to transition from breaking to governing. To push beyond enough was to risk a desperate, last-stand frenzy or to create a bitterness that would fuel the next conflict. The creativity here was psychological and perceptual, an ability to read the collective morale of the opposition and to declare, within one's own mind, that the objective had been met. It was an iterative skill honed through experience, often learned by witnessing the failures of those who did not know when to halt. In the craft workshop, enough was an aesthetic and functional standard. It was the moment the blade would take no finer an edge without risking brittleness. It was the point where the joint fit snugly, requiring no more shaving of wood. It was the precise hue of the glaze when removed from the kiln. This enough was a dialogue between the ideal and the possible, between the vision in the mind's eye and the stubbornness of the material. The craftsman's iteration was a series of approximations, each adjustment bringing the object closer to this tacitly understood finish line. To go beyond was to ruin. To stop short was to produce inferior work. The judgment of enough was the culmination of the trained hand and eye, a silent verdict that released the object from its making and sent it out into the world to perform its solved function. Within the social sphere, enough was a boundary of obligation and respect. It was the correct amount of deference to show a superior without appearing servile. It was the proper share of a catch to give to one's kin or lord. It was the point at which a jest became an insult, or a request became a burden. These were unquantifiable limits, navigated by a complex, internalized code. The problem was maintaining social equilibrium, and the solutions were performed through nuanced behavior. A tone of voice, a slight bow, a carefully timed gift, a strategic silence. Learning these thresholds was a lifelong iterative process of social trial and error, of subtle corrections based on the reactions of others. A successful life required a finely calibrated sense of social enough, knowing when you had given sufficient, asked sufficiently, or presumed sufficiently. And in the mind's own realm, enough was the limit of understanding one could bear. It was the point at which the peasant stopped questioning why the hail destroyed his crop and accepted it as God's will. It was the moment the scholar, circling a philosophical paradox, decided to set it aside and return to clearer texts. It was the edge of grief, where the mind would turn away from the raw void of loss and focus on the practicalities of burial or inheritance. This was enough as a survival mechanism, a cognitive circuit breaker. The problem was the potential for thought to spiral into unproductive anguish or paralyzing doubt. The solution was a self-imposed boundary, a decision to cease interrogation and to accept a partial, functional answer. This mental iteration was a protective one, a way to preserve the energy and coherence of the self by declaring certain lines of inquiry or certain depths of feeling to be territories beyond which it was not useful to travel. It was not surrender, but a strategic retreat to defensible intellectual and emotional ground. Therefore, enough was not a fixed point but a skill. It was the practiced ability to sense the point of diminishing returns, the moment of saturation, the edge of tolerance. It varied with circumstance, material, opponent, and internal fortitude. The entire human endeavor could be seen as a collective stumbling search for these various points of enough. In food, in violence, in craftsmanship, in social exchange, in thought. Each day presented fresh calibrations of this essential metric. Was the fire enough to last the night? Was the explanation enough to satisfy the Lord? Was the effort enough to merit rest? The answers were provisional, based on the best available data from the senses and from memory. And when the judgment was wrong, when the stores proved insufficient, when the enemy rallied, when the joint later failed, when offense was taken, when the doubt resurfaced, the lesson was absorbed, and the internal gauge for enough was adjusted minutely for the next similar situation. This was the quiet, constant recalibration of existence, the slow refinement of the intuition for sufficiency in a world that offered no meters or gauges, only consequences. The body's own rhythms became a field for iteration. Hunger was not a single alarm, but a gradient of sensation, from the first faint hollowing of the stomach to the sharp, gnawing pangs that clouded thought. The solutions were timed interventions: the morning porridge, the midday bread and cheese, the evening stew. The timing itself was an iteration, a cultural agreement on when to pause productivity to refuel the machine. Thirst was a sharper, more urgent problem with a narrower window for solution. The placement of wells, the personal carrying of a water skin, the knowledge of clean streams, These were distributed solutions to the ever-present problem of the body's relentless evaporation. Sleep was the deepest rhythm, a problem of accumulated cognitive debt. The body would present its bill through drooping eyelids, slowing reflexes, and a fog over the senses. The solution was a surrender to unconsciousness, but even this had its iterations. The search for a safe place, the arrangement of limbs for warmth, the ritual of a prayer or a final thought to ward off bad dreams. The management of these basic cycles, hunger, thirst, sleep, was the foundational layer of problem-solving upon which all other ambitions were precariously stacked. Illness was a foreign invasion, a breakdown in the body's negotiated peace with the world. A fever was a new internal climate. A wound was a breach in the frontier of the skin. The solutions were a mix of inherited lore and desperate experimentation. Herbs were gathered, their effects painstakingly correlated with symptoms over generations. A poultice applied, a fever left to burn, a limb bled to balance humors. This was iteration with poor feedback, where cause and effect were often disconnected by time or misunderstanding. The healer's creativity lay in observation and pattern matching, in the slow accumulation of recipes that seemed to correlate with recovery, even if the why remained a mystery. The body itself was the ultimate black box, and healing was the art of trying different inputs, plants, rest, incantations, and hoping for the desired output of a return to functionality. Every recovery added a data point, however imperfect, to the collective medical library. The management of pain was its own discipline. Acute pain was a signal, a bright, screaming pointer to a problem. A broken bone, a burn, a tearing muscle. Its solution was to address the source. But chronic pain, the ache of an old wound in the damp, the throb of a rotten tooth, the persistent stiffness in a joint, was a different kind of problem. It was a background noise that lowered the ceiling of one's endurance, a constant tax on attention. The solutions were adaptive. A changed gait, a favored hand, the avoidance of certain movements, the seeking of warmth. Pain became a factor in every subsequent calculation, a permanent variable in the equation of movement. The creativity it spurred was one of compensation and endurance, a lifelong project of redesigning one's life around a permanent, painful flaw in the system. Reproduction was the ultimate biological iteration, the attempt to solve the problem of terminus by creating a new instance of the problem solver. The raising of a child was a multi-decade project of iterative training. Each lesson, do not touch the fire, this is how to hold a spoon, these are the words for things, was a solution to a potential future problem transferred from one mind to another. The parent was a repository of solved problems, slowly uploading the data to the next generation. The child's mistakes were not failures, but necessary experiments, their own iterative process of testing the world's rules. The parent's role was to control the parameters of those experiments, to allow minor burns but prevent fatal ones, to permit frustration but forestall despair. This generational transfer was the slowest and most profound propagation of solutions, the passing onward of the accumulated, hard-won knowledge of how to be a human in a particular time and place. And finally, the approach of death was the final problem for which there was no solution, only a long series of managed surrenders. The body's systems iteratively failed. Strength waned, senses dulled, the mind's grip on the present loosened. The creativity here turned from fixing to arranging. The making of a will was an attempt to solve posthumous problems of property and succession. The passing on of final advice was a last data transfer. The spiritual preparations, confession, last rites, were solutions to the problem of the soul's destination, as framed by the culture. The final iterations were about letting go of solutions themselves, about releasing the need to fix, to manage, to solve. The last problem the conscious mind might address was the problem of its own extinction, and for this, the only iterative response was a gradual quieting, a letting slip of the tools, a final acceptance that the cycle for the individual was complete, even as it spun on unabated for the species, for the community, for the family, carrying forward the endless work of solving and resolving the conditions of being in a world that was itself an endless procession of new conditions. The world, therefore, was not a stage for drama, but a workshop. Every moment presented a configuration of variables: light, temperature, material, social tension, bodily state, that required a response. The responses were drawn from a deep catalog of past trials, most of them performed by others long dead. The hammer in the hand was the answer to the problem of force concentration, an answer forged centuries ago and slightly modified by each smith. The path to the river was the answer to the problem of thirst, beaten smooth by 1,000 thirsty predecessors. The word for danger was an answer to the problem of urgent communication, honed through millennia of close calls. The human was not a heroic figure battling fate, but a skilled technician moving through a landscape of pre-existing solutions, maintaining them, adjusting them, and occasionally, when faced with a novel arrangement of circumstances, inventing a new one. This new solution, if it worked, would then enter the catalog. It might be a better knot, a stronger alloy, a more persuasive argument, a gentler way to comfort a child. It would then become part of the environment for the next person, the next generation. The night would continue to follow the day. The rain would fall, the wind would blow, the body would hunger and tire. Other humans would present conflicts and alliances. New tools would create new vulnerabilities. The work was never complete because the conditions were never static. But the process itself, the observing, the thinking, the trying, the adjusting, was the constant. It was the definition of being awake in the world. To be alive was to be engaged in this quiet, perpetual, iterative dialogue with everything that was not the self. There was no victory condition, only the continuity of the engagement. And in the deepest, stillest part of the night, when even the problem-solving mind had temporarily ceased its work, the world continued its own iterations: the growth of grass, the erosion of stone, the slow cooling of the embers in the hearth. All of it a vast, unconscious mirror of the same fundamental process. The endless, patient, undramatic work of becoming what comes next. The memory of a community functioned as a shared hard drive, storing not facts and figures, but procedures. The location of the best clay for pottery was not written down. It was held in the muscles of the elders, who would point to a specific bend in the creek. The song for grinding grain, with its specific rhythm that matched the optimal motion of the quern, was stored in the voices of the women, passed from mother to daughter. The exact angle at which to hold a scythe to avoid backache was stored in the posture of the old harvesters. This was tacit knowledge, the kind that cannot be easily explained but must be absorbed through observation and mimicry. Its transfer was the most critical iteration, for if a chain of demonstration broke, a solution could be lost for generations. The community's health depended on this living library, on the old bodies teaching the young bodies the precise, physical poetry of solved problems. Gossip, often dismissed as idle, was an iterative social tool. It was the community's algorithm for updating reputations, for tracking shifting alliances, for warning of untrustworthy behavior. A story about a man who cheated in a trade was not just a tale. It was a data packet that recalibrated everyone's future interactions with him. It solved the problem of how to navigate complex social landscapes with reduced personal risk. By sharing fragmented narratives, the group built a collective, real-time map of trust and danger. The creativity in gossip was in the shaping of the narrative itself, the emphasis, the omission, the moral drawn. Each telling was a slight iteration, refining the lesson, sharpening the warning, or sometimes softening a judgment based on new context. It was a low-tech, persistent social network dedicated to behavioral regulation. The arrangement of space within a dwelling was a frozen history of solved domestic problems. The hearth was not in the center because of aesthetics, but because central heat radiated more evenly. The bed was in the loft not for privacy, but because heat rose, making it the warmest place in winter. The single, small window faced south to capture the maximum light for close work. Every placement was an answer to a question of comfort, efficiency, or survival. To enter an unfamiliar but well-organized home was to immediately understand a family's priorities. Here they value warmth. Here they need light for craft. Here they store their most precious things. The home was an autobiography written in objects and their relationships to one another. Boredom, that seemingly modern affliction, had its medieval analog, and it too spurred iteration. In the long, dark evenings, or during monotonous tasks like spinning or watch-standing, the mind, deprived of external novelty, would turn inward. It would replay conversations, invent stories, compose nonsense rhymes, or simply follow a thread of memory down a labyrinthine path. This mental wandering was not wasted time. It was the mind's way of stress-testing its own memories, of recombining ideas, of exploring hypothetical scenarios. From this fertile soil of boredom could grow new solutions to old problems, or the first inkling of a song or a tale that would later be shared. The solution to the problem of tedium was often creativity itself, a self-generated stimulus to keep the thinking machinery lubricated and engaged. And in the end, after considering the tools, the landscapes, the senses, the social codes, and the relentless internal dialogue, one returned to the hands. They were the primary interface. Their scars were a logbook of errors and corrections. Their calluses were badges of mastered repetition. Their tremors were the record of fading strength. A life's work was ultimately written there. The swordmaker's hands knew the temper of steel by the way it rang under the hammer. The midwife's hands knew the progress of birth by touch alone. The scribe's hands knew the exact pressure to apply to the vellum without tearing it. This knowledge was not in the brain. It was in the nerve endings, in the calibrated feedback loop between intention, action, and material resistance. The hands learned through iteration, and they remembered. Even when the mind grew foggy, the hands could often still perform their most practiced tasks, the solutions having sunk below thought into the realm of pure, embodied intelligence. So the story was not one of kings and battles, though those were the punctuation marks. The real story was in the continuous, verbless sentence of labor. The planting and the harvesting, the hammering and the sowing, the watching and the waiting, the teaching and the learning. It was a story with no climax because the climax would imply an end, and the work had no end. It only had rhythm, the rhythm of the breath, the rhythm of the season, the rhythm of the generation. Each day, the same set of fundamental problems in slightly new configurations. Each day, a set of responses drawn from the deep well of the past, with perhaps one tiny, almost imperceptible adjustment, one slight variation in the way a knot was tied, a field was plowed, a child was soothed. These adjustments were the barely visible vector of history. They were not progress toward a defined goal, but adaptation to an endless, shifting present. The goal was simply to be present for the next shift, and the one after that, equipped with the slowly improving, endlessly edited manual for survival that was a life, a family, a culture. The darkness outside was not an emptiness. It was simply the space where the problems of the light were temporarily suspended, where the tools were laid down, and where the only remaining task was to rest the hands and the mind, so that they might be ready to pick up the work again when the gray light returned, revealing once more the world as a field of questions waiting for the steady, iterative, unending human reply. The concept of repair held a different gravity. It was not a return to a perfect original state, which was often an illusion, but a negotiation with damage. A cracked ceramic bowl, meticulously stapled with lead rivets, became a new object, one that bore the history of its breakage and its salvation. Its value shifted from perfection to resilience. A patched cloak told a story of long use and careful maintenance, each patch a chapter in its life. The act of repair was a philosophical stance, that things were worth preserving, that breakage was not a final verdict, but a new condition to be managed. This mindset permeated everything. Relationships were repaired through carefully brokered apologies and exchanged gifts. Social rifts were mended through mediated talks and sworn oaths. The body itself was subject to repair. Bones set, wounds stitched, fevers broken. The goal was not to erase the scar, but to restore function. The world was not a place of disposable things, but of things that could be iteratively maintained, their useful lives extended through skill and patience. The repaired object often carried more meaning, more solved problems, than the flawless new one. Silence, in its deliberate form, was a tool as precise as any chisel. It was used to convey disapproval, to create space for thought, to exert pressure in a negotiation. A lord's silence after a request could be more terrifying than a shouted refusal. A craft master's silent observation of an apprentice's work was a profound critique. The strategic withholding of speech solved the problem of saying too much, of committing too early, of revealing uncertainty. It forced the other party to sit with their own words, to interpret the void, often projecting their own fears into it. This was an iterative social skill of the highest order, knowing when the absence of sound could achieve more than its presence. It required the discipline to resist the human urge to fill empty space, to let the unsolved problem hang in the air until the other side moved to solve it themselves. The dream state was the mind's own nightly workshop, where the materials of the day were broken down and reassembled into strange, symbolic forms. Problems unsolved in waking life would recur in dreams as monstrous obstacles or endless, looping tasks. A forgotten obligation might manifest as a lost object in a labyrinth. A social slight might become a public shaming in the town square. This was the subconscious continuing its iterative work without the constraints of logic or physics. Sometimes a solution would emerge upon waking, a new perspective on a quarrel, a sudden understanding of a craft problem. More often, dreams served not to solve, but to process, to wear down the sharp edges of daily anxiety through bizarre repetition. They were the mind's way of maintaining itself, of defragmenting the hard drive of experience, preparing it for the new data of the coming day. The creativity of dreams was chaotic and involuntary, but it was part of the system, a nightly reboot of the problem-solving apparatus. The shadow, that companion of all solid things, was a constant, changing metric. In the morning, it stretched long to the west, a measure of the day's newness. At noon, it shrank to a pool at one's feet, a sign of the sun's dominance. In the evening, it stretched long again to the east, a herald of the closing curtain. People used shadows as crude clocks and calendars. The shadow of a specific tree touching a certain stone meant it was time for the midday meal. The length of a noon shadow in different seasons told a rough story of the year's turning. The shadow solved the problem of marking time without a manufactured device. It was a free, reliable, if approximate, instrument. Its iteration was as regular as the cosmos itself, a daily, yearly loop that framed all human endeavor within the grand, slow pivots of the planet. And in the very end, after the last repair was made, the last strategic silence held, the last dream dreamed, and the last shadow measured, what remained was the pattern. Not the story of any one person, but the pattern of their actions. The way they lifted a cup, the particular sigh they made when tired, the tune they hummed while working. These patterns were the true output of a life of iteration. They were the solutions that had become so ingrained they were the person. In the memories of others, the deceased lived on not as a list of deeds, but as a collection of these tiny characteristic patterns. The way they tilted their head when listening, the specific pat they gave a dog, the cadence of their walk. These were the human equivalents of the repaired pot rivets or the patched cloak. They were the evidence of a unique journey through the common set of problems. The distinctive were patterns left on the soul by a lifetime of engagement with the world. The person was gone, but the pattern of their solutions lingered in the minds of those who knew them, a quiet, personal library that would subtly influence how those left behind approached their own daily rounds of problem and response, adding one more faint, echoing iteration to the endless, collective, murmuring work of it all. The quality of materials dictated the boundaries of the possible. A piece of green, unseasoned oak was a problem of warping and splitting. Its solution was time, the patient years of drying in a timber loft. The iron from a bog, rich with impurities, was a problem of brittleness. Its solution was the rhythmic folding and fire welding under the hammer, driving out the weaknesses. The craftsman did not begin with an ideal. He began with a specific piece of the world, with its own grain, its own flaws, its own reluctant personality. His creativity was a conversation with this stubbornness. He learned to work with the knot in the wood, to incorporate it into a design rather than fight it. He learned to sense the stress points in a piece of metal before they became cracks. The solution was never imposed from pure imagination. It was co-authored with the material. This respectful, constrained dialogue was the essence of pre-industrial making. Every object was a unique treaty between human intention and the innate resistance of stuff. Music and rhythmic sound were tools for coordinating labor and managing the perception of time. The sea shanty synchronized the pull of ropes, turning individual effort into a single, efficient motion. The miller's song, "Time to the Turning of the Stones," helped maintain a steady pace. The repetitive chant of monks in prayer was a technology for marking the canonical hours, structuring the seemingly uniform flow of the day and night. This was iteration made audible and collective. The rhythm solved the problem of collective timing and individual fatigue. It allowed a group to move as one organism, and it gave the tired mind a point of focus outside of its own discomfort. The next beat, the next line, the next chorus. The creativity lay in the adaptation of old songs to new tasks, in the slight lyrical variations that spoke of a specific place or crew, turning a functional tool into a bearer of local identity and shared endurance. The mirror, whether of polished bronze or still water, presented the problem of the self as an object. It was an opportunity for a rare, iterative adjustment to one's own presentation. The straightening of a tunic, the smoothing of hair, the practiced adjustment of an expression from weariness to neutrality before an audience. This was the solving of the social problem of one's own appearance. It allowed for the crafting of a face to meet the world, a minor but crucial piece of social armor. For most, this was a fleeting, functional check. For the powerful or the vain, it could become an obsession, an endless iteration upon an image, an attempt to solve the problem of mortality and decay through the maintenance of a surface. The mirror reflected back not just features, but the anxiety of being perceived, and offered the illusion that this, too, was a problem that could be managed, adjusted, and controlled. The management of refuse was a low-grade, constant iteration. There was no away. Food scraps went to pigs or dogs. Human waste went to middens, to later be spread on fields as fertilizer. Ashes from the hearth were used for making lye for soap or for scouring pots. Broken pottery was pounded into grog to temper new clay. This was a closed-loop system born of necessity, where the output of one process became the input for another. The creativity was in seeing potential not in new materials, but in the byproducts of daily life. The problem of waste was redefined not as disposal, but as redirection. This mindset shaped the landscape. A midden was not a trash heap, but a slow-release nutrient bank. A broken pot was not rubbish, but a future pot in a different form. Everything cycled, and the human role was to shepherd materials from one useful state to the next, minimizing loss in a world where every resource was accounted for. Finally, the stories told and retold around the fire were the narrative iteration of collective values and fears. The same tale, told by a different teller or in a different season, would have subtle shifts. A villain made slightly more sympathetic, a hero's flaw slightly more emphasized. These stories were not just entertainment. They were ethical and practical training modules. They presented archetypal problems: the breaking of a taboo, the facing of a monster, the keeping of a foolish promise. And they modeled solutions or the dire consequences of poor choices. Each telling was an iteration, refining the moral, adapting it to current concerns, ensuring the survival of the lesson across generations. The story itself was a living thing, evolving to stay relevant, to continue solving the problem of how to teach the young what the old had learned, not through lecture, but through the hypnotic, memorable power of narrative. In this way, the past was not a dead weight, but a tool constantly resharpened by retelling, ready to be applied to the perennial problems of human nature that sunlight and tools and repaired pots could never, on their own, hope to solve. The sensation of temperature was a relentless negotiator. Cold was not merely an absence. It was an active force that stiffened joints, slowed thought, and made the simplest task, tying a lace, striking a flint, a battle of numb fingers against uncooperative materials. Its solution was layered defense. The innermost layer of linen to wick, the middle layer of wool to insulate, the outer layer of leather or waxed cloth to block the wind. Each layer was an iteration on the theme of heat retention, a solved problem worn on the body. Heat in excess was a draining force. It liquefied resolve, drew salt and water from the skin, and turned labor into a slog through thick air. Its solutions were about dissipation and rhythm. Working in the shade, soaking a cloth to wrap around the neck, shifting labor to the cooler edges of the day. The body itself iterated, acclimating slowly over weeks, its sweat becoming more efficient, its thirst mechanisms sharpening. Temperature was a problem that could never be permanently solved, only managed through a daily, seasonal repertoire of adaptive behaviors and technologies. The eye of the storm, the moment of false calm in the midst of chaos, was a problem of perception. After the initial clash of armies, or the first fury of a gale, there could fall a strange, suspended quiet. The noise receded, the immediate pressure eased. This was not safety, but the eye's deceptive promise. The experienced soldier knew this was the time to reform the line, to tend the wounded, to ready for the next assault. The sailor knew to use this lull to check for damage, to secure loose gear, for the wind would return with a vengeance from the opposite quarter. The problem was psychological: to resist the lure of respite, to understand that the cycle was only pausing, not breaking. The solution was disciplined action against the body's craving for collapse. This moment was a test of iterative learning. Had one been through enough such cycles to recognize the pattern, to know that the work was not over, but merely entering a different, equally critical phase? The concept of fairness was not an abstract ideal, but a practical algorithm for distributing limited resources and mitigating conflict. The rules for dividing a hunted stag, for sharing water from a common well in a drought, for allocating strips in the open field, these were evolved, iteratively tested solutions to the problem of communal survival. They were not perfectly equitable, but they were known, and their knownness prevented daily disputes from escalating. A sense of fairness was the social grease that reduced friction. Its application was creative and situational. An elder mediating a dispute would not simply invoke a rule, but would craft a judgment that considered status, past behavior, and future harmony. This was fairness as a high-resolution tool, applied case by case, its iterations refining the community's sense of justice into something workable, if not philosophically pure. The skill of estimation was a cognitive muscle exercised constantly. How much seed for this field? How long will that timber last in the repair of the bridge? How many days of hardtack remain for the garrison? There were no precise instruments, only the calibrated judgment of experience. A farmer could scoop a handful of grain and, by its weight and feel, estimate a yield within a narrow margin. A carpenter could eye a tree and see not just a trunk, but the specific beams and planks it could yield. This was iterative knowledge in its most refined form, the compression of 1,000 past measurements and outcomes into an instantaneous, intuitive gauge. The problem was the future's inherent uncertainty. The solution was a pattern recognition so deep it felt like a sense. A mistake in estimation could mean hunger, structural failure, or defeat. The pressure to refine the skill was absolute, and its quiet mastery separated the merely competent from the vital, relied-upon pillars of a community. And in the liminal spaces, on a journey between known places, in the hour between sleep and waking, in the pause between one decision and the next, the mind faced the problem of its own undefined state. These were moments free from immediate, external demands, and thus potentially fertile, but also fraught with a subtle anxiety. The solution was often a deliberate, small ordering ritual. The traveler might check his pack's contents for the 10th time. The waking person might recite a familiar prayer. The deliberator might polish the same small object in his pocket. These were not necessary acts, but iterative anchors, tiny, repeated gestures that defined the self against the formlessness of the transition. They solved the problem of existential drift by providing a thread of continuous, purposeful action, however minor, that tethered the consciousness to a sense of agency and continuity. In a life composed of solving concrete problems, these intangible moments between problems required their own small, invented solutions, rituals that said, "I am still here, and I am still the one who decides what to do next," even if the next thing was simply to wait for the world to present its next, more definite question.